Whether your fantasy team exploded out of the blocks like Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Week 1, or perhaps your squad is still in preseason form, the good news is we all woke up this morning with another chance at victory. It's Week 2, and we're on our normal home, ESPN2. Welcome into Fantasy Football Now, alongside Matthew Berry and Stefania Bell on Field Yates. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. You guys look so dapper.
Thank you,
How much did Matthew pay you to say that?
No,
I
see you during the week.
The surprise in her voice was like, this field always looks good. She looked right at me when she said, "You guys." You know what I mean? She was just like, it was in the surprise in her voice.
Yes,
Stefania is brilliant at
many. The purple, I like it. You guys are very colorful.
Let's be clear about this. You are brilliant at many, many things in this world. You're a terrible actress. She's like, wow, you look so. I'm just saying.
Exception.
Absolutely.
We all have our strengths and limitations,
yes.
Stefania. Don't you worry about that. Your strengths far outweigh your limitations, but we've got a lot to get to. So let's get right into it with today's opening drive. If your team hasn't had an injury crop up yet, consider yourself lucky. 5 of the top 20 receivers in ADP are already down, and it starts at the top with Michael Thomas. And tight ends aren't immune to it either. His 49ers star, George Kittle, will miss Week 2 against the Jets after spraining his knee in a Week 1 loss to Arizona. And what do we know about the running back timeshares? Well, 8 different teams had multiple running backs get 10 or more touches in Week 1. Can we be confident that one guy eventually takes over? Plenty to look into today, including all of those stories, which we'll dive into throughout the next 3 hours. But as we step back for a second, Matthew, what is the biggest storyline you're watching as we enter Week 2?
For me, I think it's trying to get some clarity on running back usage in a lot of places. So today we're going to first look at Miles Sanders. Is he going to be the bell cow, or will you see a lot of Boston Scott? We'll see about Malcolm Brown. Is he going to be the guy for Los Angeles as we saw last week? I want to see that. Does Austin Eckler and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, do they get involved in the passing game this week, which we didn't see in week number 1? We need clarity in a lot of backfields, like Detroit, like Pittsburgh. Is it James Conner or is it Conner and Snell? Like Washington. There's a lot of different backfields and running backs that I think we need to figure out what's going on with them. So a lot of question marks in terms of backfields around the NFL. That's, to me, the biggest storyline of week 2.
You know the biggest storyline is for me? And not to be too psychiatrist here, but it's managing your emotions, right? Week 1. You may well be 0-3 in your 3 leagues. But you know something? It's a long season. We think back to all the players that started in Week 1 last year that weren't necessarily stars for the rest of the season, or the opposite. It's a long season. You've got plenty of hope ahead. Stay consistent, continue to set those lineups, and, of course, monitor the waiver wire. But, Stefania, we've got a ton of injuries that we are tracking. And look at this list right here. Oh, my goodness.
Don't I know it?
The players already ruled out for the 1 p.m. games. This is just the 1 p.m. games. Phillip Lindsay, Kenny Golladay, potentially a second-round pick. Chris Godwin, potentially a first-round pick. A.J. Brown, George Kittle, Jamison Crowder, Jack Doyle. And, of course, in the later games, Michael Thomas, the consensus number 1 wide receiver going into this season, basically amongst all rankers for us at ESPN. My goodness, a lot of storylines to cover there, Stefania. But there are 2 of those names that really stand out above the rest, and they're Michael Thomas and George Kittle, both ruled out for Week 2. So let's look forward. Might these be prolonged absences?
I think in both cases, you have to consider that possibility. Look, Adam Schefter reporting this morning that George Kittle suffered an MCL, medial collateral ligament sprain. And if you saw the injury, I think this is where it gets really interesting. He had a hyperextension to his knee. These often happen on sort of a diagonal. Most people who hear MCL, by now they know this is an injury to the ligament that protects the inside of the knee. You think of a lateral blow. He took a hyperextension force, so he probably caught a little more than just the ligament. Bone bruising, a capsular injury, things that could create swelling and pain that can linger for longer than just a week. And consider this, the 49ers play 2 consecutive weeks on the East Coast, playing on turf at the Meadowlands. The thought was if George Kittle feels better, he might travel to West Virginia and play next week. I say stay tuned. If you're the 49ers, you might want to just save him for Week 4. Michael Thomas, high ankle sprain, friendly fire from Latavius Murray rolled up on his ankle. He supposedly wanted to fight and play through this, but look, this is the smart move. You don't play him on Monday night. We know high ankle sprains are often a little bit tougher to recover from, especially when guys try to plant and pivot. Again, he wants to press through. He doesn't miss time, but the smart move may be to make sure he's 100% before they put him back.
This is going to sound backwards for a second, Matthew, but hear me out. It stinks to lose players that you probably drafted in the first or second round, Michael Thomas and George Kittle. Some people may have started their draft with
those
Thomas
two guys,
and Kittle.
yeah, sure.
but I would much rather have the clarity on Sunday morning, especially with the Monday Night Football player, of knowing both of these players are out and finding fill-ins.
1,000%, because at least now you can plan. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, Stefania talking about Kittle maybe missing multiple weeks. The 49ers are 0-1. I mean, I'm not trying to rub salt in your wounds here, Stefania. It's it hasn't been often that my Washington team is 1-0 and your 49ers are 0-1.
Funny how they
take the opportunity to point
together.
that out. But, I mean, they have a tough matchup today as well, right? I mean, so I think they probably win this game, but what happens if somehow the 49ers fall to 0-2?
George Kittle's on the first flight on Monday morning.
I mean, like, you don't want to be 0-2 in the NFL. And so, I don't know. It'll just be interesting to see what happens. As for, let's just talk quickly replacements here. So if you don't have George Kittle, so I think you'll see some Jordan Reed, right, today, but also Ross Dwelley, a tight end that I actually like more than both those guys, because I don't know how much Jordan Reed plays. Yes, he has familiarity with Shanahan from Washington, but for me, how about Mo Alley Cox, who's going to be the starter? Who's going to be the starter in Indianapolis, filling in for Jack Doyle. We know how much Philip Rivers loves to throw to the tight end. He is a big guy. He's a former basketball player. He's like 6'6". I'm very excited to see Mo Alley Cox today. I'm his tight end 19. He's available in pretty much every league. And, of course, Logan Thomas should be still out there in a lot of leagues as well for my Washington professional football team.
Tight end, wide receiver replacements will keep you locked in on all the names you need to know. But it's time now to begin our stadium tour as we head out to Philadelphia for the Rams and the Eagles. And is that Sal Paolantonio or just a cardboard cutout of Sal Pal? What is going on, Sal?
Good morning, Field Yates. Yes, it is my doppelganger cardboard cutout here at Lincoln Financial Field. Here I am. Yeah, the Eagles gave me the opportunity to have a cardboard cutout in the stands with all the other fans, so I made a donation to Eagles Autism Foundation to make sure that we got that done. I was listening to Matthew Berry say, hey, can I have some clarity at the running back position? I wish I could offer that, but I really can't.
Interesting stuff there, Steph. So let's start, though, with the running back position to try to get some clarity there. As Miles Sanders missed this past week. What are your expectations, though, in terms of how much of a workload he might see? There's so much hype and expectation surrounding him coming into this season.
Right, he missed week 1 at Washington, and he missed most of training camp, but he was full participant in practice. And remember, the Eagles had 50 dropbacks in that last game against Washington with only 17 called rushing plays. That didn't work, especially in the second half. Led to all kinds of turnovers by Carson Wentz, all kind of protection problems, sacked 8 times. So I'd like to offer some clarity, whether or not it'll be Miles Sanders for the entire game or whether Boston Scott will spell him. But my guess is that they will run the ball more. Little birdie tells me they will run the ball more in this football game. But I think, whether or not Sanders, A, finishes the game or gets the load of carries that everybody's expecting, I'm not so sure about that.
Sal, you mentioned the 50 dropbacks last week. That resulted in 42 passing attempts, and 17 of those went to Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz, the terrific tight end duo in Philadelphia. How involved do you expect those two players to be this week?
Very involved. Simple reason. Ball's got to come out quickly. Aaron Donald and friends are in town. Everybody saw what Aaron Donald did to the Dallas Cowboys offensive line last Sunday night. Everybody saw what the Washington front four did to the Eagles offensive line. The result was, of course, those 2 interceptions by Carson Wentz, 8 sacks, most in his career, 1 lost fumble, and short field position for Washington. Washington had the best field position of any team in week 1 in the second half last week. So it's incumbent upon Carson Wentz to get the football out. And when I texted Doug Peterson this morning, I asked him what was his advice to Carson Wentz right up to game time, and he said, we've got to protect the football.
Certainly do, Sal. Let's go to the other side of the ball. Last Sunday night, we saw Malcolm Brown be the man in the Rams' backfield with 2 touchdowns. But how do you expect the backfield split to be this week with Cam Akers and potentially Darrell Henderson also in the mix?
Yeah, I think it's going to get spread around. This is a game, Sean McVay against Doug Peterson, or let me be much more precise. Sean McVay, against a Jim Schwartz coach defense, has had trouble running the football. Been under 100 yards running the football in the 2 losses in the Doug Peterson, Sean McVay era. So they've had problems running the ball. And I think they will continue to have problems running the football against this Eagles front 4. And I think it will really be more of the backs in the screen game. In the 2 games against the Eagles, Jared Goff is 7 for 7 on screen passes against the Jim Schwartz defense. But here's the key. None of those screen passes has gone to the tight ends. 0. All 7 went to the backs. Used to be Todd Gurley. I expect the running backs to have limited rushing opportunities and limited rushing yards, but they will get their touches in the passing game because Sean McVay relies so much on the screen game, and they haven't had success throwing it to the tight ends in the screen game.
Sal, there's nobody better to get us started on Fantasy Football Now every Sunday morning, and I don't know what it's going to cost me, but somehow, some way, I am going to purchase that cardboard cutout of you, whether it's on eBay or directly from you. It's all I want in life.
And I'll sign it for you and send it to Fantasy Football. Hey, on Fantasy Football, you have to have a doppelganger, right? It's
No
the working
doubt.
definition of a reporter in the field. Absolutely.
All right. That'll be a perfect addition right to my left here on the set. Thanks, Sal. As always, you are the best.
You know, I don't want to give up this seat, but if it's for Sal Pal, I'll do that.
Oh, I
thought you were saying like right
plan.
there. I thought you were saying right. Yeah, just put the
Notice how I didn't
cardboard
say
cutout
like
of
you know
Sal
over
Pal.
here, like to
I
my
noticed.
left. Very specific.
I
with
noticed.
that mention there.
Yeah.
Interesting as always. Insight from Sal Pal, and he's
Right.
great. Matthew, we heard about the running backs there, and it sounds like, and you would not be surprised that any team would have its concerns about rushing against that excellent Eagles front 7, specifically the defensive line. Are you trusting Malcolm Brown with the possibility of maybe some more passing game usage this week?
I'm not. I mean, look, I am just, if you're starting a Rams running back, I think it's Malcolm Brown, and I think that's important. You know, you heard Sal mention it, and obviously you think about the majority of the McVay offenses, they have used the running back in the passing game significantly. Now, that was one of the problems last year with Todd Gurley, is they actually didn't. You know what I mean? They just didn't use him in the passing game here, and it does feel weird that, like, just from a skill set standpoint, if you're picking which Rams running back you think is probably most likely to be effective in the passing game, Malcolm Brown's probably not the top of the list, right? So it'll be interesting to me. I mean, here's my concern here. Eagles have allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to running back since the start of 2019, the 3rd fewest rushing yards, the 4th lowest yards per carry against running backs here. And again, Darrell Henderson just barely got a taste last week. You'll see some Cam Akers here. Again, if I'm starting a Rams running back, it's Malcolm Brown, but I don't have any of them inside my top 20 field because I think it's going to be a bit of a committee here. And this is a tough matchup against an Eagles defense that, let's face it, desperately needs a win. They're 0-1. This is very important for the Eagles.
Brown had 3 catches last week. We'll see if that workload can continue, but I hear you.
Are you buying it?
No, I hear you all the way around. I just will be interested to see if this is a hot hand approach in Los Angeles.
I mean, if I set the over-under it, and I'm making this up, but like at 4.5 catches.
I take the under.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
I hear you. No,
put it at 3.5. I'd still take the under. Sure.
I think about it at least. I'd
Fair enough.
I'd consult Stefania, who I'm going to consult on Miles Sanders right now. So you heard Sal Pal's intel and report. Not sure we have certainty that it's going to be 100% Miles Sanders in that backfield. There will be some dashes of Boston Scott in the mix, Stefania. So for those that are making the decision about Miles Sanders, is it as simple as you drafted him probably in the first round, you're playing him today?
I think so, and I'll tell you why. The Eagles were already cautious last week because we heard he was making good progress. Remember, he started in the preseason with the undisclosed injury. We then found out heading into week 1 it was his hamstring. There was some question that he would play, but they decided to err on the side of caution, hold him out for a week, which I think was very smart for them, thinking of the big picture. Miles Sanders himself said he feels 100% ready to go. He got in 3 full practices this week. It's not a decision that was coming down to the wire. But knowing that the Eagles have been snake bit a bit by the injury bug, I would think that they're going to be cautious. There will probably be a lot of conversation, as there often is when a guy's coming off a hamstring injury. How do you feel after a series? How's it going? How does he look? And that's how they will end up ultimately deciding. And if there's any hint that it's coming back or it's bothering him a little bit, then they're going to curtail his use. So really hard to predict ahead of time exactly how it's going to go.
You know, I helped Chapin's cousin, my wife, her cousin, with her fantasy draft this year. And
No one likes a bragger.
Well, Matthew helped Jay-Z, and I believe a couple of other A-listers.
I'm not talking about me, brother. I'm just saying you. It's fine. Your name dropping your wife's brother. I get it. I'm fine.
A cousin, but close enough. Her first-round pick was Miles Sanders. So I really need Miles Sanders to come through because otherwise I'm going to be distant relative, whatever the opposite of distant relative of the year is, that'll be me. Quickly here, Matthew, before we get out.
Yeah.
Dallas Goedert played awesome last week. You expect him to be a weekly top 10 play at tight end?
I do. Look, he led the Eagles in targets, catches, and yards in week number 1. He was a top 10 fantasy tight end last year. We know he's insanely talented. I know the Eagles personally love him with a capital L. And so, yeah, for me, Goddard, I think, clearly a top 10 play today. I'm at tight end 7 for the week. It's a good matchup with the Rams. But, yes, I think he's a legit top 10-ish tight end for the rest of the season. That offense has shown it can support 2 fantasy-relevant tight ends. Just to quickly wrap on this, you're starting Miles Sanders. Let's see what the workload is, but if you have him, you're starting Miles Sanders. To me, Malcolm Brown is more of a decision. He's a flex play for me today. So
you guys may have heard this already, but things aren't going so great right now with gangrene in New York. The Jets placed Le'Veon Bell on IR this week. Crazy as this sounds, did you place him on waivers in your league? A live report from the Meadowlands is next.
Fantasy Football Now is
Countdown at 7:30. Stop 2 on our stadium tour is the Meadowlands at East Rutherford, New Jersey, where my Monday night tailgate partner, Diana Rossini, is there. Good morning, Diana.
Good morning, Field. Yeah, no tailgates out in the parking lot here in New Jersey, but Jets fans are all going to have their eyes on this game today, hoping that somehow Adam Gase and their quarterback here can turn this around right now, because we know they came out looking pretty flat, and they are pretty much depleted at this point as they get ready to face the San Francisco 49ers, who are out with their star tight end today.
Well, what more can you tell me about George Kittle along those lines, Diana? Because he did not travel, as we know, to New Jersey. But how is he doing based off what you've been able to gather? And when might we see George Kittle back on the field?
Yeah, so he's back in San Francisco right now, rehabbing. They're being very conservative with him. They know that he wants to get out there. He's done such a good job in the past of fighting through injuries. And Kyle Shanahan, who's always very transparent about injuries, he does a really good job of just pretty much saying how it is. He admitted that they're going to hold him back, even though they know that Kittle wants to get out there. This team is also going to be out on the East Coast because next week they got the New York Giants right back here at MetLife Stadium. They're going to be in West Virginia in between this game and next game. And George Kittle, I'm told, is going to be flying out to meet the team in West Virginia tomorrow. But I did talk to Jimmy Garoppolo yesterday about what this offense is like without Kittle. And Jimmy will be the first to tell you, yeah, of course we want our go-to guy out here, but obviously it's the next man up mentality. And he said, truthfully, I have a lot of confidence in this tight end group. He said, we are really prepared. These tight ends are the best at preparation of any other unit on our offense. And he said specifically Jordan Reed has been really impressive. And Fields, when I covered Jordan Reed when he was with Kyle Shanahan in Washington, when Reed was healthy, he was such a dynamic pass catcher who really ran routes more like a receiver than a tight end. And he could cause a lot of trouble for this Jets defense, especially in the red zone. And Garoppolo says that he's going to be his go-to guy today as they try to put up some points without their guy, George Kittle.
A familiar face in Jordan Reed to those that play fantasy. And shout out to Diana for fighting through the hype squad in the background here. The Jets have been far from immune to their injuries this year, Diana, as not just Le'Veon Bell, but also Jamison Crowder now banged up as he is out for this game because of a hamstring issue. Who is it that catches passes from Sam Darnold? Because the Jets wide receiver group is a bunch of unfamiliar faces.
Yeah, Rashard Perriman, right, the former Raven. He's going to be the guy that's going to probably get more looks today from Sam Darnold. He's the next receiver to step up now that their number one guy is out. But also in the tight end spot, Chris Herndon, if you recall, 2 years ago, he had a breakout game with Sam Darnold. And this past week, listening to press conferences and even talking to some players on this team about what we can expect from this offense, it was Herndon's name that I heard over and over again. But of course, we know with this Jets team, protecting Sam Darnold has been the issue. So getting the ball out from Sam is really going to be the problem. But if he is successful in that area, look for the tight end to have a good day.
Diana, last one here is about Le'Veon Bell, who was placed on IR this week. But in reporting on his injury, what's been your general sense of maybe how long he's going to miss and whether this might end badly, because the injury was just the latest in a long string of dramatic events between Bell and the organization?
I know, it's really been a strange back and forth, right? Going back to training camp when Adam Gase said that he had a hamstring injury. Then Bell went on social media and tweeted, "I'm fine. I don't know why I'm not out there." Then they met. They cleared the air. Then Adam Gase this past week admitted that he shouldn't have had put Le'Veon Bell back in the game last week because he said he was dealing with that injury, but he obviously trusted his player, and perhaps maybe that wasn't the right call there because now we see Le'Veon Bell on IR here. But in terms of the injury, we know hamstring injuries, they're always sort of lukewarm in terms of how you can gauge when the player is going to come back. You know Bell is going to try to work through this, but from what I can gather in terms of when they expect him to be back, we know he is on IR. I think they are going to be very conservative with Bell here to make sure that this injury doesn't become any worse than it already is. But obviously, the bigger story around this is really the communication issue, it seems, that the New York Jets have with their star running back.
Diana, they need to find something good right now in New York. I'm afraid the 49ers are not exactly the opponent you typically get that goodness from. Thank you, as always, for the great insight.
Yeah, I apologize for this obituary. I really need to pep it up a little bit more, but we know this depleted Jets team certainly needs a lot of help today, and hopefully they'll get some of that.
You know, Diana, I'm sending you to Kansas City next week. Not that it's my decision, but they always have good things going on with the Chiefs. So that's your Week 3 plum assignment. All right, Diana, we'll talk to you next Sunday morning. So great stuff there, as always, from Diana. And Stefania, this Le'Veon Bell injury, I can't stop sort of wondering what the actual conclusion will be. Doesn't sound like there's a ton of clarity on a specific timeline, and we know this might be more than just an injury. There could be a lot more layers to this. What's your sense on how this all shakes out?
I think this is why this is so problematic. Hamstring injuries already don't have a set timeline, right? We see the gamut, and depending on the severity of the injury, we know that he's down for at least 3 weeks because of the placement on IR. But we don't know, even if he gets healthier, how reluctant his coach is going to be to utilize him. So this is just a mess I'd want to stay away from because I don't know that we're going to have clarity until he's back in the lineup. And if it doesn't come right away when he comes off IR, would you want to be week to week wondering what his status is going to be?
How about this, Matthew? Because I think Stefania is making a lot of points that a lot of people who roster him are feeling right now. If you had Le'Veon Bell, is he droppable already?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not actively doing it. Hopefully you have an IR spot and you just slap him in there and see what happens. But you think about this, right? So he's going to miss the next 3 weeks.
Yep.
Right? You're not feeling great about starting him the first week back.
No.
So now you're saying you're without him for at least the next 4 weeks. Now you're into week 6 before you're actually thinking about starting Le'Veon Bell. Like, you can't afford to carry, quote unquote dead weight until week 6. And so, ideally you have an IR spot, or maybe you can you can trade him to someone in your league, even if you take 50 cents on the dollar. But I think we all play in fantasy football, you play in probabilities, right? And you feel it's much more likely, at least I do, it's much more likely that Le'Veon Bell has little to no fantasy value this year than he becomes the superstar that you expected. It just lots of bad vibes out of New York. Now, does he get in a new situation? Could this be a Kenyon Drake situation last year where obviously very different players in very different situations, but the fact is it obviously wasn't working with Kenyon in Miami. He goes to Arizona, and over the second half of the year, he was awesome. So
that's a long ways away, though, obviously.
Yes.
So I felt like when I asked you and you said yeah, you can drop. I felt that.
It's a bummer, right? I mean, look, he was a preseason fade for me. I have no Le'Veon Bell this season, but a lot of people do, and I get it. None of this feels good. And in terms of replacing him, for me, it's going to be Frank Gore today. Great, fine. You'll see some Josh Adams. You'll see some Kalen Ballage.
Say Ballage is
the Ballage Barrage, the Ballage Mahal. But to me, the interesting guy here is LaMichael Pirine, who's a draft pick. He's not going to play today, but he's a little bit banged up in preseason. But he's a rookie, and if the Jets season goes the way we think it's going to go, he could have some significant playing time over the second half of the season. He's a guy that I like to stash and grab and to sort of wait on.
We're going to use the rest of this block for Stefania to just wax poetic on Frank Gore, the eternal Frank Gore. No, I kid. Although, shout out Frank Gore. But Jamison Crowder, Stefania, gosh, it's like every time I turn, there's a new Jets injury. What's the latest? What do you sense on, is this going to be a 1 week thing for Jamison Crowder, or how long might this last?
Well, we have the disadvantage of him getting hurt in the middle of the week. So something happens at practice on Wednesday, doesn't practice the rest of the week, he's out this week. It's not really like a full 2 weeks since the game. So a lot is going to depend on what you see out of him this week. Does he make it back into practice? I mean, if it's a very mild strain, you could see him back next week. But they've already shown, at least with Le'Veon Bell, that they're going to go conservative on a hamstring issue. Now, maybe that's the player. Maybe that's not the case with Crowder, but stay tuned.
All right, Matthew, in the other side of this game, someone needs to catch passes from Jimmy Garoppolo. We heard about Jordan Reed. Brandon Ayuk, their first-round pick, should make his debut. Intriguing at all?
Not to start. Intriguing that, I want to see it. Obviously, it's a rookie that they have high hopes for. But, look, you'll see some Mohamed Sanu out there. You'll see some Jordan Reed. Look, Jordan Reed's the name everyone knows, but the last time Kittle missed a game, it was against Arizona, I believe, and Ross Dwelly had 2 touchdowns. So I think I think you'll see some Jerick McKinnon and Kyle Juszczyk out of the backfield. I think it'll be mix and match. Jordan Reed is one of those, Hail Mary plays. I've been on record as saying this, and maybe I'll look dumb because Diana gave a glowing report, but if you're streaming tight ends, I prefer Logan Thomas and Mo Alley Cox over Jordan Reed today. I want to see it on the field first. It's been a while since Jordan Reed has been out there on the NFL field and been effective in fantasy.
Certainly.
And he's one of my favorite Washington players of all time.
All right. Well, if wide receiver injuries this week are storyline 1, well, running back committees are 1A. Damian Woody joins us next to tell us if this trend will continue week 2.
For years, you've been pushing lopsided trades on your buddies in your fantasy league. No one ever buys what you're selling, and you're not making any friends. But what if there were a trade assistant, like a powerful AI from IBM that could analyze thousands of potential trades and suggest trades that are mutually beneficial? Surprise, there is. Check out Trade Assistant with IBM Watson in the ESPN Fantasy app. It's a win-win. Trade Assistant with IBM Watson, official sponsors of the Win-Win.
Season 1. Streaming live on the ESPN app. You know who was awesome last week? Damian Woody. And no beginner's luck. This man is just skilled. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Now. You nailed a couple of your calls from last week, including Carson Wentz and Saquon Barkley struggling, Damian. But one thing that we all saw was there were a bunch of running back timeshares in week 1. Do you attribute this more to teams not having a preseason and sort of sorting things out? Or do you expect this trend to continue with teams splitting the carries almost evenly amongst multiple backs?
I think it's going to be the latter, Field. Listen, we saw in week 1 the amount of injuries that's already starting to pile up, even with these teams that's going running back by committee. Marlon Mack, who's out for the year. Phillip Lindsay, who's going to probably be out for a month, and obviously Le'Veon Bell with the hamstring injury. So, with the lack of preseason, I think we're going to see a lot more running back by committee moving forward.
Along those lines, Damian, do you expect that the Bucs will continue with the backfield by committee? Because on the one hand, Bruce Arians loves Ronald Jones. On the other hand, they signed Leonard Fournette, who, in theory, should be good. He was the 4th overall pick in the draft just 3 years ago.
Well, listen, I think fantasy owners and people out there just needs to relax a little bit. Leonard Fournette just got there, guys. I mean, that's the biggest thing. He only had, I think, like 5 or 6 carries in that game. So the longer he goes and the more he's acclimated to the system, his usage rate should jump up along with to pair up with Ronald Jones. So I think he's definitely going to get more touches.
I'm asking this question for a friend. By that, I mean I'm asking it for myself. I have Saquon Barkley in the War Room League. He had 6 rushes last week. 6 yards last week. That's 6 more than I had. I had 0 attempts. He had 15. You think he's going to bounce back against this Bears defense today?
I do think he's going to bounce back. This was a Bears team that gave up, almost 93 yards on 14 carries to the ageless wonder, and Adrian Peterson last week against the Lions. So you would think that Saquon Barkley will have his opportunities against that Bears defense. I like Saquon in this game.
All right, I feel like every year the Chargers have like 8 injuries before the season even begins. Well, now they're without their starting center, Mike Pouncey, for the rest of the season. He's on IR. How concerned does that make you about an offense that last week already kind of struggled against a lesser opponent in Cincinnati than they'll face today in Kansas City?
I'm worried, Field. I'm worried. You know, we saw what the Cleveland Browns did to that same Cincinnati Bengals defense, just shredded them, and the Los Angeles Chargers couldn't do anything on the ground against that Bengals defense. So that's a huge hole in the middle of that Chargers offensive line, and that's something that's going to have to be addressed over time.
Damian, we appreciate you, and at some point, we're going to have you on here for a little Jets therapy session, just you and me hashing it out, man.
I don't know if the audience really wants that.
Oh.
That could get ugly.
Okay, well, if your Twitter account's any indication, the masses love it. It's highly entertaining. Thank you, Damian.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about that Bucs backfield. And, we talked about with Damian the idea that these things could remain sort of split workloads. Do you think, Matthew, that at some point one player takes over that job? Or do you foresee this being a full season of a split? And the Bucs offense didn't look great last week, but do you think that was mostly just the matchup? Like, the Saints are no joke now.
Saints are really good defense, and, also Mike Evans wasn't 100%. I know he played a lot of snaps, but It felt like he didn't practice much last week. It felt a little out of sync to me. I feel like this is probably more of a committee, but the weird part is that I think that while it's committee, it's going to be one guy every week, meaning like as opposed to like every week there's like it's all split up. I feel like this could be a Ronald Jones week, and then another week it's a Leonard Fournette week. And I just think about last year, right? And just think about Bruce Arians. We've seen this before, other than when he had David Johnson. Arians has sort of mixed and matched guys, over the course of his NFL career. And last year, we'd be like, oh, it's Peyton Barber. Okay, Peyton Barber would have a huge game, and then the very next week, Ronald Jones would be the guy. Obviously, Tom Brady's going to have a huge influence in this offense, and Tom Brady comes from New England, where they've had a lot of success using different running backs in different formations with different matchups. And so my expectation, if you're starting a Bucs running back today, I want it to be Ronald Jones. I don't think he did anything against the Saints that said, nope, you got to get him. But we've heard talk that they like Fournette there, and you don't sign that guy to not use him at all. And it's a great match with Carolina. So could Fournette get a carry or two and suddenly get hot and then he goes with it? Yeah. So I have Jones ranked the highest of my Buccaneers running backs, but he is not without risk, certainly.
I have decided to come up with a new segment. It's called Fade or Force.
Okay.
You either fade a backfield or you force one player in there. And Damian mentioned how great Adrian Peterson was in week 1 against the Bears. Lions backfield. You fading it entirely or you're forcing a player in there?
I'm fading it. Look, I said at the top of the show that getting running back clarity is one of the big things that I think we need to do here in week number 2. And so, look, if you have, again, I would prefer to fade it. Like, there's a lot of running backs until we get some clarity. Like, we're in week 2, and while there are a lot of injuries, most of them are at the wide receiver and tight end position. I feel like you should be able to start 2 guys you feel good about at the running back position here in week number 2. Like DeAndre Swift is probably the most talented running back in that backfield and the guy that's going to get the most passing game usage, but, got under 10 carries, under 10 touches last week, dropped the touchdown to win the game. How does that affect a young player? We just don't know. He could bounce back and have a monster game, or he could go into a shell. We just don't know. Adrian Peterson was the most effective running back there. Expectation here is that the Packers win this game and is up big, so you probably maybe favor Swift. I have Swift ranked 1 spot higher than Peterson, but to me, if I can, I'm fading that backfield.
One more, fade or force. The Buffalo Bills, who have 2 really talented guys in their backfield. They just didn't get a whole lot going on the ground last week.
That one I'm actually forcing. I think Zach Moss gets in the end zone today. Okay. I'm calling that shot right now.
Second straight game.
Yeah, right. Scored last week, and look, he missed some reads last week, and he had an uneven debut. But I know they like him a lot in Buffalo, and you have to love the matchup with Miami here. Given the mobility of Josh Allen, it's hard for a defense to focus on stopping the run game. And so I think Singletary and Moss both have nice games here. Both are legitimate flex plays today. But at choosing between them, give me Zach Moss over Devin Singletary because I think he's got the better shot at a touchdown today.
I am not sure how the Emmys voting process works, but tonight there's still time for a new award-winning segment, Fade or Force. Stefania, you're just an Emmy, walking Emmy, basically. What's the latest on Phillip Lindsay? Damian mentioned him. It's a toe injury, and that doesn't sound fun for a running back.
No, turf toe. And I think when we talked about this during the week on the podcast, I said that these are really tough injuries because it's a sprain of the big toe, and the last thing to leave the ground when you push off, as you do when you're a running back or receiver, is your big toe. So that's a lot of weight going through a very small surface area, and if you can't handle the weight on it because it's uncomfortable, it doesn't move the way it should, then you're not going to be able to be effective. And the problem is if you don't address it properly at the outset, then you have an injury that lingers throughout the year. We saw sort of a worst case scenario with A.J. Green in Cincinnati, ultimately having to have it surgically repaired. Now, I'm not saying it's that bad, but I'm saying this is why you don't push it. And that's why you're hearing multiple weeks, likely for Phillip Lindsay, probably more Royce Freeman this week to complement Melvin Gordon.
Well, I was going to say the good news for Melvin Gordon is that he probably has to be even more of the man than he was last week. The bad news is he plays the Pittsburgh Steelers. That defense is nasty. So we told you about how Damian was nailing picks left and right during week 1. How about Mike Clay? He told you, don't sleep on Paris Campbell. He's back next to break down Paris Campbell's matchup against the very young Vikings corner.
Up the scoreboard, that is, against a dreadful Panthers defense. But I hate Carson Wentz, who has to run for his life from Aaron Donald behind that awful Eagles line. That running back David Johnson is running like it's 2016, and he'll get even more touches with Duke Johnson banged up. But I'm not running out to play Melvin Gordon in week 2 against the Steelers D that had Saquon Barkley running the wrong way. From running to galloping, Michael Gallup, that is. Sorry, that was bad, but not as bad as Atlanta's defense. And Sunday, expect Gallup to run free through that Falcons secondary. But don't expect much from Cooper Kupp in week 2. His targets continue to drop while the Eagles continue to lock down the slot better than any defense in the NFL. He's my little Cooper Kupp.
I'm Cooper Kupp.
Not your name.
Matthew's little Cooper Kupp.
Just not this week. Okay, that's all for week 2. Gotta run.
I don't know why I laughed. It was good. That was very good. Good job by you. You don't have to wait any longer for the great Mike Clay, who joins us now. Of course, Mike is the author of wide receiver cornerback matchups on ESPN.com every week. And Mike, last week you told us, before the season began, don't you dare miss out on Paris Campbell. Well, he's now not really available because so many people heeded your advice. How about his matchup today? After 6 catches in week 1, do you like what he has in store against the Vikings defense in week 2?
Absolutely, and I mean, just look to last week to see what the Packers wide receivers did against this Minnesota Vikings secondary. 315 yards, 4 touchdowns, the most fantasy points scored by a wide receiver group last week. They actually allowed the Vikings to the 5th most fantasy points to perimeter receivers. Why is that notable? That's where T.Y. Hilton lined up 90% of the time last week. Zach Pascal, a deep sleeper, also out there as well. And then in the slot, they allowed the 7th most fantasy points as well. That's where Paris Campbell lined up 95% of the time. So we're just upgrading all of these wide receivers against this Minnesota defense. By the way, they're also without Cam Dantzler. He was number 1 in terms of snaps among their corners last week. So they're young, they're struggling. It's going to take a while for these young guys to come around, upgrade all the Colts receivers this week.
Yeah, and Mike, in a week where there's so many injuries, that is super helpful. Yesterday, Stephon Gilmore had his birthday. So did my sister, by the way. Would you be playing DK Metcalf against Stephon Gilmore, or would you be fading entirely?
Look, in 10-team leagues, I'd be trying to get him out of my lineup. This is a very tough matchup. Look, Stephon Gilmore always shadows number 1 perimeter wide receivers. And you might be thinking, well, Mike, why is he not covering Tyler Lockett this week? Well, look, Lockett lines up in the slot 75% of the time. DK Metcalf lines up on the outside 76% of the time. So Gilmore generally in these situations, especially since Metcalf is much bigger than Lockett, will just shadow that big talented outside wide receiver, and then they'll let Jonathan Jones cover Lockett in the slot. So that's what my expectation is this week. And remember, Gilmore may not have been his dominant self in week 1, but this secondary is basically the same that we saw last week, at least at the cornerback spot, or last season, I should say. And they allowed the fewest fantasy points to receivers, the second fewest to perimeter receivers. It's a very tough matchup for Metcalf and for David Moore on the outside. So I'm downgrading all of these guys, honestly. I'm going to even downgrade Lockett a little bit, even though he's not going to face Gilmore much.
Any of those Seattle wide receivers you'd remove from your lineup if you could now, Matthew?
Yeah, look, I understand what Mike is saying here. With DK Metcalf, it may not matter because, like, DK Metcalf can win a jump ball. But the fact is that since the start of last year, the Patriots have allowed 4 touchdowns to wide receivers. 4 since the start of 2019. So basically, to me, the only way that DK Metcalf pays off today is with a touchdown, with like sort of a jump ball scenario. So I understand, like in a 10-team league or a 12-team league, if you're only playing 2 wide receivers and you have better options, I get it. I don't think he is a must-start the way he will be every other week of the season here. I love the call on Paris Campbell, somebody we talked about a lot in the preseason as well. It's a great matchup for him. They're clearly looking for him. 9 targets last week. It might be, Field, time for Paris to be burning. Thank you very much. You don't even get that reference. There you go.
That's take the rest of the show off.
Some of these are for me. Some of these are for me.
You can make one person laugh. Mike, you of course are 1/3 of the award-winning CSS DFS podcast. And if you had to make a lineup, who will be some of the locks, the fixtures of your daily fantasy lineups in week 2?
Well, avert your eyes, Matthew, because I was all in on Arizona this week on Daily Wager earlier, and I'm going to stick with that right here. I'm going to go with Kyler Murray as the play at quarterback this week. He's only 6,100 at DraftKings, the 11th highest priced quarterback. This is a guy who last week had 2 touchdowns, 230 pass yards, 91 rushing yards, and the 5th most fantasy points at quarterback at the 49ers, one of the best defenses in the NFL. Now he's at home against Washington. I think he has a big week. And that's the case as well for Kenyon Drake at the running back position. He's only 5,900 at DraftKings. He played 69% of the snaps last week, had 16 carries in that game. Only 2 targets, guys, but ran 18 pass routes. So he'll see more targets going forward. Like him as a value at running back. Pivoting to wide receiver, Mike Evans. He's the 11th highest priced wide receiver. He's facing Carolina. And Chris Godwin is out. He is going to be the guy here. It's an elite matchup. He's going to see Dante Jackson, Troy Pride, Rasul Douglas. It is a shaky cornerback room. We're going to upgrade Evans. And I also really like Chris Herndon this week. You heard Diana Rossini talk about him earlier. He's at home playing the 49ers, yes, but he's somehow, guys, the 23rd highest priced tight end at DraftKings. I don't understand that. He was relatively quiet last week, but played 72% of the snaps and saw 7 targets. There's no Jamison Crowder. It should be all systems go for a huge role here for Chris Herndon. So I think all of these players, terrific values this week at DraftKings.
Great stuff there, Mike. Matthew, any follow-up thoughts on these lineup values?
Yeah, listen, I'm in on Mike Evans. I also like Scotty Miller in that same game here. I'm with him on Chris Herndon as well. That Niners defense, while they have a big name, they are a little bit banged up this week. I hear you on the Cardinals. We'll see. I think my Washington defensive front is a little bit better than people think. Look, Kyler Murray's going to have a big game here, but I feel like a lot of people are going to be on him. So to me, he's more of a cash game play than a tournament play because I think he's going to be a very popular selection today.
Go find Mike on Twitter at Mike Clay NFL. You are the best. Thank you for all the great information. As always, Mike.
Thanks, guys.
All righty. Well, if you're a little bit freaking out after what happened in week 1 with Saquon Barkley, fear not. We have all the information to ease some of those concerns. That's next on Fantasy Football Now. All right, now it's time for smart trade decisions informed by IBM Watson. This is one that I had sent along to me, and the opportunity to trade away Sterling Shepard, Christian Kirk, and Devin Singletary and get back Devontae Parker and Kareem Hunt. Hunt coming off of a great game this past Thursday night. And perhaps part of the motivation for this trade would be that, as Matthew noted earlier, Zach Moss is for real in that Buffalo backfield. You're trying to move away from a backfield that might eventually be, well, could still stay, I should say, a share for the entire season and possibly upgrade at wide receiver as well if Devontae Parker can find the mojo that he had all of last season. Interesting trade for me to ponder right there. All right, let's head out to Chicago, and we get the opportunity to speak to the incomparable Michelle Steele, who's playing a home game herself today, covering the Bears and the Giants. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Field. Nice to see you and hear from you. It feels like much longer than it actually has been this offseason.
Every time is very relative these days, but it was great to talk to you 17 years ago when we last spoke, even though it was actually in December. Let's move forward to the game on Sunday afternoon here, Michelle. And for those like me who have Saquon Barkley, we were less than enthused with 15 rushes for 6 yards on Monday night. But the Bears are not the Steelers defensively. What are you hearing about the Giants and their plans and their expectations for Saquon this afternoon?
Yeah, Field, it could be a real feast or famine situation here, quite frankly, for Saquon, especially against a defense that has something to prove after really not playing up to their standard last week. This is the 5th time, I should say, that Barkley has been held under 30 yards rushing for a game in his career. And I can say that the following 4 games after that, he really hasn't bounced back strong. averaging 53.5 rush yards per game, or just 3.3 yards per carry. Now remember, this is a Chicago defense that allowed Adrian Peterson 93 yards on the ground last week. So we're going to have to see what happens in today's game, but I can tell you that at practice this week, he brought it every single day, and this offense knows they need Saquon to get going to be successful. My take, Field, is Saquon is more likely to be Yaquan than Naquan.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
It totally does, and I'm borrowing that for future reference here, Michelle. And I love that you're playing through distractions. The public address announcers trying to steal your vibe. It's not happening. Never to Michelle Steele. A player who was awesome this past week for the Giants was Darius Slayton. He had 2 touchdowns on Monday night. He has 10 since week 5 of last year. How much do you think he can remain involved for the Giants? And that could be tied to Golden Tate. What are you hearing about his availability with that hamstring issue?
Yeah, Golden Tate is going to be back, according to our own Adam Schefter. Danny Dimes finally has his full slate of offensive weapons for the first time in the 2020 season. Tate is active, back in the lineup, but the feeling is he might be eased back into things, at least for his first game this season. You know, that being said, Slayton and Danny Dimes have built up really a trust level over the offseason, and certainly last week, week 1, that's really started to pay off. And as long as Saquon continues to draw the bulk of attention from defensive coordinators as he did last week, that's going to create chances here, Field, for Slayton and the Giants offense. And our own Giants reporter, Jordan Raanan, actually brought up some really good stats. This has worked out really well for Slayton, especially downfield, where he flourishes with 24.1% of his receptions having been for gains of 20 or more yards.
Late last night, I was sleeping because I'm an old man. Adam Schefter was reporting because he's a machine. And he reported that Tariq Cohen got a 3-year extension from the Bears. Allen Robinson, though, Michelle, still looking for that new long-term deal. What, if any, impact might the pending contract extension for Robinson have on his role today, or maybe his fantasy outlook?
Yeah, that might be a question on some fantasy owners' minds this morning, if there's any, on-the-field effect from the drama surrounding Allen Robinson this week. I was actually able to speak with him, and I asked Robinson if he had any unease or, anxiety, especially on the field. When you put your body on the line every week and the threat of injury obviously is always there, and that could hurt whatever hopes he had to be paid respective to his production. And he told me that he is going to compartmentalize those emotions, basically. He wants to keep the main thing, and the Bears are really lucky that they have a receiver who, despite his frustrations, he's going to keep putting up numbers, he's going to keep producing. Spoke with a league source this weekend, and he said that Robinson's attitude is the same. He wants to dominate in this game, and he has been very dominant for the Bears. He leads in targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. He also makes Trubisky better. Get this, Trubisky's QBR jumps to 75, Field, when he targets A-Rob. That kind of rating would be good enough. A 75 QBR would be good enough to be ranked just behind Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes last season. So A-Rob has earned it. Those talks are ongoing, and he says that whatever's happening off the field is not going to affect him with what he does on it today.
Michelle, I like a positive Mitch Trubisky stat every once in a while. Too much hate on Twitter for Mitch. I appreciate your insight. As always, enjoy the game.
Yeah, you too.
All right, so Matthew, the question with Saquon Barkley in any week is not, are you going to play him? If he plays, you have to play him. But the bigger question is, for those that are looking to be a daily fantasy enthusiast, is it worth paying the premium on Saquon Barkley? And I thought Michelle's report was solid and encouraging about Saquon. So it could be feast or famine, but if it's feast, Saquon worth the price today?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're trying to accomplish here. So in a cash game, maybe not. For that sort of money, I think I prefer Derrick Henry, for example, who's a little bit safer, right? Higher floor. Jonathan Taylor, somebody else that like a lot, but I think those guys are kind of chalk picks. If you're looking at a tournament play, if you're looking at sort of a contrarian play, then yes, I'm in on Yaquan. I liked that from Michelle Steele.
It sounds better when Michelle says it than when you say it.
For the record,
being honest,
everything sounds better when Michelle says it than when I say it.
Okay.
Real Steele is the best, but I'll say this: since the start of 2019, Bears have allowed 16 rushing touchdowns to running backs. That's tied for the 5th most, and I was encouraged by the fact that Barkley, despite being completely stopped as a runner by the Steelers last week, was still heavily involved in the passing game. And I think that's what's going to happen here as well. And so I thought Jason Garrett actually had some nice play calls for Barkley in the passing game last year and some nice concepts. So for me, if you're asking me about daily fantasy, yeah, 100%. I think that he is very much interesting as a contrarian play, as a tournament play, something like that.
Got some good news. We're less than 2 hours from kickoff of the 1 p.m. Eastern time games. We have just crossed 11 a.m. on Bristol time. So let's discuss Darius Slayton, Matthew. We talked about him throughout the week on the podcast. The stat is, since week 5 of last year, Darius Slayton has 10 receiving touchdowns. A complete list of players that have more than 10 since that time? Oh, there is no list.
Interesting.
Darius Slayton,
what you did there.
Man at the top of the wide receiver.
Like you set us up and then you just kind of got the rug out from under us.
Appreciate you explaining that on national television. Let's talk about Darius Slayton, whether he should be in your lineup this week, Matthew.
You went this way and then you went that way. Yeah. Okay. Darius Slayton. Here's the thing about Darius Slayton. He's boom or bust, like you just mentioned. Like he's got, so does he have boom potential today? Of course he does, right? I have him as wide receiver 39, basically. So I have him in wide receiver 4 territory. If I'm starting a Giants wide receiver, that's who I would actually start over Sterling Shepard. Because I do think he has that big play potential. Golden Tate's going to come back today. We don't know what that offense looks like with Golden Tate out here. And the Bears are pretty good defensively at home traditionally, especially against passers. This feels like a bit of a low-scoring game as well. Again, since the start of 2019, Bears have allowed the 3rd fewest touchdowns to opposing wide receivers here. When Darius Slayton doesn't get into the end zone, he's not particularly great for fantasy. So, like I said, I'm as a wide receiver 4. He's very boom or bust.
As we're now at the top of the hour, we're going to go back to the injuries that we are tracking, about 25 minutes until inactives, and look at the name of players that have already been declared out for the 1 p.m. slate. Of course, the headliner is George Kittle in that group, but also A.J. Brown with a knee injury. Kenny Galladay, he missed week 1 as well. And then we know Monday Night Football, there will be no Michael Thomas. But you better watch the game on ESPN. First game at Allegiant Stadium. As we look at this list, Stefania, all I can think is what is going on with all of these wide receiver injuries. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I apologize for pivoting here. But it is time for us now to go down to AT&T Stadium and say good morning to Edward or Natalie Cladd. As always, Ed, I love the purple. I don't know if you can see me, but I too am rocking the purple this morning. Your sartorial splendor is always unmatched.
Well, it's not surprising, Field, given that we used to be partners in the War Room League at ESPN.
That's
where
right.
You did a lot more work than I did, by the way.
Oh, come on, Ed. There are going to be fans in the stadium, but I don't see any backup dancers behind you. What is going on? This is throwing me off.
Budget cuts, buddy, budget cuts.
Okay, well.
Yeah, the Cowboys the Cowboys are actually expected to set the early season pandemic record for NFL attendance here today. Jerry Jones says no announcement about the capacity will be made until sometime during the game, but Mike McCarthy expects a crowd of around 20,000. And to put that number into some perspective, the Cowboys' average attendance for last year, 90,929, the highest in the NFL. The Jets are next, actually, with 12,000 fewer. But Field Dak Prescott said this week that he expects having even that level of support will make a huge difference.
Ed, for the first time, or not the first time, but unfortunately the Cowboys are dealing with, for another time, some injuries up front along the offensive line, and they're going to eventually have Ronald Leary in for a visit. Speaks to some of the depth hits they've taken. How concerning is this for the skilled players in Dallas's offense?
Yeah, well, the guy you're mentioning, the Cowboys plan to evaluate left tackle Tyron Smith here before making a final decision. They have about 25 minutes to declare inactives, and he's yet to be seen out here. Normally comes out and warms up early, not a good sign. Smith suffered a neck injury in a midweek practice. And remember, the Cowboys endured the biggest pass protection disaster of Dak Prescott's career 3 years ago without Smith playing left tackle. The Falcons sacked Prescott a career high 8 times in what's universally regarded as the worst coaching job of Jason Garrett's 10 years. So I think the Cowboys would certainly struggle offensively without both their tackles, because remember, Lael Collins is already on IR. They're probably expecting a huge game out of Prescott and his receivers, considering that Russell Wilson completed 88% of his passes with 4 touchdowns and no throws into tight windows against the Falcons in week 1. And the Falcons defense certainly failed in many ways, Field, against Russell Wilson, but they did hit the quarterback. Takk McKinley had a sack and an NFL high 6 quarterback hits. He's a power rusher off the edge. Grady Jarrett is a disruptive presence inside, a potential mismatch there. And Dante Fowler brings speed off the edge. The Cowboys only 7-5 in games they play without Tyron Smith at left tackle.
Well, two teams that are both 0-1. A lot of urgency today, Ed. And for Atlanta, they still have a relatively new face in the backfield as Todd Gurley made his Falcons debut last week and came out hot in the first half, and then faded in the second half as they were trailing by many points. What do you make of this matchup, though, against the Cowboys today?
Well, first of all, Matt Ryan threw a league-high 54 passes, 450 yards, the most in week 1. The Falcons had 3 100-yard receivers, and when I asked head coach Dan Quinn this week about that, he said, hey, it's nice that happened, but I don't want that to be our identity. That means we're throwing it a hell of a lot more than we want to. Look, Quinn wants offensive balance. He wants to use the play-action pass game. Todd Gurley was effective, as you said, in the first half with 51 yards rushing, but he played just 46% of the snaps overall because Atlanta was behind in the game. Quinn told me he's not managing Gurley's playing time like the Rams were doing last year. And keep in mind, in his career, Gurley averages 126.5 yards per game against Dallas, his 4th highest on a per-game basis against any opponent he's played multiple times. So a good matchup for Todd Gurley, I think.
There might be close to 20,000 people inside the stadium, but none of them matter more than our guy, Ed Werder. Ed, we appreciate you as always.
Thanks, Field.
All right, a lot of information there from Ed. We're going to talk about that and so much more. But next on Fantasy Football Now, the Bucs have injury concerns. Mike Evans is going to play, but Chris Godwin not going to play. We have a report next from Tampa Bay. Seattle Storm. The encore of our stadium tour brings us to Jeff Darlington, who is reporting live from Tampa. Jeff, of course, our Florida expert and aficionado. And Jeff,
that's right.
Good morning. We know that Mike Evans is going to play today, and he was removed from the injury report. But does that mean that he is 100%? And how soon do we expect to see Chris Godwin back in the mix for the Buccaneers?
Yeah, all important questions for this Bucs offense. And I'll tell you this, Bruce Arians was very clear that he didn't think that Mike Evans was playing slower or dealing with any hamstring issues, even against the Saints. Evans also sort of echoing that sentiment, saying, look, he's been dealing with hamstring injuries for a lot of his career, but he was able to run full speed against the Saints and quite honestly felt like he had a pretty productive game other than the miscommunication that led to a Tom Brady interception. So the good news there for Evans. Now, the bad news for Godwin that you mentioned, he was not able to clear concussion protocol. He is out of this game. So as I know Matthew also feels, as I do, on Scotty Miller, Scooter Miller, focus on him. He is not just a slot guy. He is a speed receiver capable of being a deep threat. I'm with you, Matthew. This guy is going to be a stud, and if you don't have him yet on your roster and he's available, you should.
All right, some love for Scooter right there. Great stuff. But let's talk about the backfield in Tampa, because last week it was sort of the Rojo show, but we do expect Leonard Fournette to eventually become more involved. How do you expect this backfield to shake out today?
Yeah, Ronald actually had a pretty productive game. Now, the one area that we continue to need to watch when I have conversations here with Bucs people is the passing game out of the backfield. And that's an area that during training camp, Jones was not necessarily as successful at. Some drops there. And part of the reason why they felt like bringing in Leonard Fournette would be a good thing. Fournette, a versatile back who can catch passes out of the backfield. So I still think that sooner than later, we're going to see Fournette heavily involved in this offense. Could that be today? I hate to tell you, I don't know just yet, but I still do think it's coming for Leonard Fournette.
Okay, maybe fade for another week or so with Leonard Fournette. But Gronk is back, as we know. He had a relatively quiet week 1 with a couple of catches, Jeff. But O.J. Howard did find the end zone. What do you make of the tight end rotation in Tampa? And is one going to emerge as a player we can have in our lineups?
So talking to some people around the whole situation, really, honestly, with Tom Brady and with the Bucs, a little surprised that Gronkowski wasn't as involved last week. We'll see if the game plan maybe changes that a bit. It feels like going back to some of those seam routes with Gronkowski could be in order, because last week they tried some things with him that didn't necessarily work. Maybe allow O.J. Howard to do some of those more creative types of plays and go back to the bread and butter when it comes to Gronkowski. I think that I could really envision them trying that. So just because we didn't see Gronk overly productive last week, that isn't a sign of things to come. I actually think that Gronkowski will be more involved in this game than he was last week.
Robbie Anderson went viral this week for mistaking a fake Panther as a fake bear. But he also had a huge week 1, Jeff. Does he figure to stay as prominently involved for Carolina?
It's a tough call here because he had such a big pass there, 75 yards, I believe, that you're not going to have that every week. But, obviously a guy who's relied on that sort of big play-making ability throughout his career. So the one area that I'd be watching, though, is the defensive backfield for the Bucs actually was very productive against the Saints. They did a really good job against obviously excellent wide receivers. I don't know that Anderson's going to be able to be as productive this week as he was last week, just because I have so much respect for what the Bucs defensive backfield is capable of.
I love the DJ in the background here, Jeff. You remember growing up as a kid, sometimes someone would say, my dad can beat up your dad. It's true. Your dad could beat up anybody's dad because a very cool moment last night. Let's show this up here on a full screen. As your dad, at the age of 76, tell us more. He can deadlift how much?
It was 315 pounds that he lifted there, and he actually thinks he can do more. He can set the world record next July in the deadlift at 76 years young. I don't know where it came from, but my dad did not pass that genetic quality onto me because I can't even lift the bar field. I'm so impressed by what he did, though.
Well, sometimes the apple does fall far from the tree. Jeff?
In this case, it definitely does.
It's okay. Don't worry. Listen, I'm like a bag of nickels over here, so I can't say much about being a weightlifting aficionado. Great
Props
stuff.
to Papa Darlington.
That's right.
Much love.
Thanks, guys.
From
Appreciate
Fantasy
that.
Football Now.
Very cool to see Mr. Darlington just crushing it. Thanks, Jeff. We appreciate it as always.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate that.
All right, let's start with the Buccaneers wide receiver, Stephania. And I think the focus really is on Chris Godwin. What's the line you always repeat about concussions and the progress of them?
I know. It's actually, as Matthew often says it for me now, it's a nonlinear progression, right? You can't say day 1 it's going to be like this, day 2, day 3. Now, I will say they listed him as limited on Friday, so it sounds like he did a little bit of work, whatever that might have been. That is the first phase, is that you introduce some kind of cardio or aerobic activity, then football activity, then contact, etc. Remember, he didn't show symptoms until a couple of days after the game. Then he self-reported, which is very important, players do, and then went into the protocol. So a little bit of a delayed start, if you will, going in, and we just will have to wait, watch, and see. But if you want to take a little note of encouragement, it's that he got bumped up a little bit on Friday in terms of activity.
Matthew, the Bucs running backs are also a major question mark right now. You heard Jeff talk about some of the struggles for Ronald Jones in the passing game, but maybe we're not quite yet to the point where we can trust Leonard Fournette. How soon do we get there?
Yeah, listen, Jeff didn't know. I mean, Jeff's point was Leonard Fournette will be involved in this offense sooner rather than later. I don't know if it's going to be today. So again, like we've talked about at the top of the show, we've talked about it throughout the show, we want clarity. There's a lot of uncertain running back situations, and I think Tampa Bay is one of them. Listen, if you're telling me I need to start a Buccaneers running back, I'm going with Ronald Jones because at least we've seen him. And so, but I'm with Jeff. Jeff is as plugged in as anyone. And so if Jeff says Fournette's coming, Fournette's coming. It's just a matter of whether it's going to be happening now or in a couple of weeks. And so my expectation here is that Ronald Jones does have a good game. It's a very good matchup here with Panthers defense that just gave up 3 scores to Josh Jacobs last week. I think Jones is a high upside flex. There's certainly some risk there. He did see 73% of the running back touches in week number 1 and 75% of the running back red zone touches for Tampa Bay. Those are all encouraging signs. So I think they will switch over to Fournette at some point, but I don't know if that happens today, and I'm not willing to risk it until I see it.
All right, in your mascot-only league, I know that Sir Purr is a consensus starter this week, but is Robbie Anderson in your lineup this week after that huge Week 1 performance?
I'm his wide receiver 33, so it depends on sort of your roster. He's not a starter for me in a 10-team league.
Yep.
I am as a starter basically in a 10-team 3-wide receiver league, or as a flex play potentially in a 12-team league or deeper. The thing about Robbie Anderson is you like the 8 targets. You like the 6 for 114. A lot of it came on that one big play, but that's Robbie Anderson's game. And the expectation here is that the Buccaneers just poured on Carolina. So they're going to have to throw to keep up with them. The Panthers are going to have to throw to keep up. And so do I think Anderson could get deep for one? Sure, I do. But again, he's a similar boomer bust type player as others we've talked about. McCaffrey and DJ Moore are going to touch the ball a ton here.
Well, as we know, Christian McCaffrey, sort of his kryptonite last year, if such a thing exists, was that Buccaneers defense.
That's true.
Of course, you're keeping him in your lineup, but maybe a fade for those that are out there playing daily fantasy today. We've got a ton of injuries, and I mean a ton. But we'll give you the names you need to know at the waiver wire to help you fill those roster spots. That's next, Fantasy Football Now. All right, it's time now for Lemons into Lemonade, brought to you by Truly Hard Seltzer. We don't want to make light of injuries, Stefania, but obviously there are a lot of names that are out this week. Some fantasy lemons, if you will. Let's begin with Kenny Galladay for the Detroit Lions. What do you know there?
Well, this is starting to be a concern, right? Kenny Galladay with a hamstring issue that already cost him week 1, still not practicing. So definitely out this week. Maybe another week.
And if they did not put him on IR, so they could have had an extra roster spot if he was going to miss 3 weeks. So I'm going to start here with, see if I can highlight him appropriately, and I'm doing it on the wrong thing. I even have this iPad right in front of me. We're trying to go contactless here on Fantasy Football Now. Corey Davis, who led the Titans in catches, receiving yards, air yards per target last week, routes run, snaps played amongst wide receivers, I think is due for another nice day today. He's been a little bit banged up himself. This matchup against the Jaguars doesn't scare me that much, though, Stefan.
And especially with A.J. Brown out now with a knee bruise, Corey Davis could be a big target for them. Way to turn lemons into lemonade with a touchscreen
I appreciate that very much, Stefania. How about Jamison Crowder, who got hurt midweek for the Jets? Man,
we don't like midweek or late week. Well, we don't like injuries at all, but when you get hurt in practice in the middle of the week, that is not good for your outlook, especially another hamstring issue for wide receiver. No Jamison Crowder this week.
Let's go to Paris Campbell, who we talked about early on in the show. Mike Clay gave us this name last week. He had 6 catches, so this matchup today against the Vikings is a favorable one, according to Mike, because of all their inexperience at quarterback, plus an injury to Cam Dantzler. Paris Campbell could be in store for another nice night. Afternoon, I should say. How about Philip Lindsay, Stefania, in the backfield for Denver?
Yeah, really unfortunate for him. Wanted to come in and stay healthy all year and really prove himself after they signed Melvin Gordon, but Philip Lindsay suffers a turf toe injury in week 1. Very problematic. I think people think, a toe, what's the big deal? But you got to put all your weight through that big toe. Is the last thing that leaves the ground. Really tough for a runner. Probably out multiple weeks. You got to make plans for him, not only for this week, but certainly for next and potentially beyond.
So we talked about fade or force earlier on the show. Would you put a player from a crowded backfield into your lineup or not? Generally speaking, I don't want to play Adrian Peterson, but the pickings can get slim quickly at running back in fantasy football. So I'm going to go with Adrian Peterson, who last week proved that he will play until he is 62 years old. He had 93 rushing yards in his first game with the Lions. He got signed like an hour before kickoff, and he already made an impact.
Trying to match my Frank Gore.
Right. Those two are just awesome. Couple more waiver wire ads to note here as I do once again screw it up. Scooter Miller for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's actually Scotty. He just has earned the nickname of Scooter. I believe that's from Tom Brady, which counts for something. Jeff Darlington just gave us some encouraging words about Scooter. They play the Carolina Panthers today, one of the most inexperienced defenses in the NFL coming into this season. The Bucs need to get things going, and of course, no Chris Godwin on the field. And then I could probably pick any number. I could pick any number of really Jets players because of all the injuries they've got.
Against my Niners.
That's right. Chris Herndon. It's nothing to do with the Niners, by the way. But Chris Herndon, their tight end, a player they were really encouraged by 2 seasons ago as a rookie. They've got all the injuries we discussed. Mike Clay mentioned this player, Chris Herndon, as a daily fantasy building block because of his price. I like him in season long as well. Really talented guy that they need to come around. It's not just him. They need the quarterback play to be better. They need the offensive line play to be better. But with no Jamison Crowder, Le'Veon Bell on IR, the Jets are down to the narrowest of wide receiver depth charts you'll find in the NFL. I think Chris Herndon could have a productive day today, and those are the names you need to know on the waiver wire to help you fill in for one of your injury players or somebody that just did not perform to expectations in week 1. All right, coming up on Fantasy Football Now, A.J. Brown is among. Back on Fantasy Football Now, and it's about 11:30, just a couple minutes after, which means that inactives are rolling in. And we're going to start with a couple of the notable ones. We're sort of waiting on the full list of players, but one of the most notable storylines, not typically discussing offensive tackles and offensive lines for inactives, but early word is that Tyron Smith's going to be out for the Cowboys, Stefania, he might be, he's one of the 3 best left tackles in football. This has a huge impact on their offense.
I feel like when Tyron Smith is injured, we talk about him. And last year we did the same thing, and we saw how much it impacted the Cowboys. He hurt his neck in a midweek practice. He was a game-time decision, and that's why we're just finding out about it now. Although, if you took your clues, they did elevate tackle Eric Smith from the practice squad yesterday as one of their cornerbacks went on injured reserve with a rib injury. They are hurt, banged up on the offensive line. If you look at the number of players Dallas has on IR, they have almost double the number of any other team in the NFL right now. This is a problem.
That's a problem. So when you hear that, Matthew, as I'm sort of scanning for more inactives right here, what does it mean for the skill guys amongst that Cowboys offense?
Certainly, I think it is an issue. I will say that in terms of actionable advice, I don't know that there's much, right? I can't imagine benching Dak Prescott if he's your season-long fantasy quarterback. You're still starting him. I can't imagine benching Amari Cooper or Michael Gallup if they're your season-long. I think both guys, because we still think this is going to be a shootout. We still think this is going to be a lot of points scored. You're not benching Ezekiel Elliott. Now, if you were thinking about CeeDee Lamb as a flex play, maybe you lower him a little bit. And I think you can lower expectations for the offense as a whole. But in terms of what do I do now? Tyron Smith is amazing. And there's no question that the numbers between what Dak Prescott does with Smith in the lineup versus what he does without are stark.
Yeah.
But in terms of I just can't see myself going to my lineup and clicking out for Gallup or Cooper or Dak or Ezekiel Elliott because of this news.
All right, let's talk about
especially given the matchup. In a different situation, maybe, but
let's talk positives here, Stefania. And
But for DFS, maybe you're thinking differently.
Courtland Sutton missed week 1 for the Broncos, of course, with that shoulder issue. He's active today. Is that trustable for you or no?
For me, I'd be staying away, and here's why. Courtland Sutton suffered an AC sprain, so the point of his shoulder, and one of the big challenges after an injury like that is being able to get your arm overhead. And we heard last week when we were wondering if they were going to activate him or not, that he really wasn't doing anything with his arm. Well, this week he's in practice, running hard, definitely pushing to get back. But apparently, when he's running and catching passes from the quarterback where he turns and faces with his uninjured shoulder, fine. Catching with both hands, that arm goes up in the air. But when he has to turn towards his right, he was making one-handed catches, and they were not with the injured arm. My concern is that he's out there, but he's not able to be the guy that you would want him to be if you're starting him in fantasy. So a limited Courtland Sutton is what I expect since he's active.
And you hear that, Matthew? What's your assessment of whether you would trust Courtland Sutton going into your lineup today?
Absolutely not. So they're traveling on a short week to Pittsburgh. What from the Broncos offense last week and from the Steelers defense last week would give you any sense of confidence? I get it. You probably drafted Courtland Sutton high, but you're hearing what Stefania's talking about. It's a bad matchup here. The only Bronco that I don't even feel good about it, but the only Bronco that I'm considering starting in that game are Melvin Gordon and Noah Fant. And both guys, I think you would lower expectations for given the matchup with Pittsburgh, which is one of the best defenses in the NFL. They're loaded for bear. This game is in Pittsburgh. Again, Denver traveling on a short week across the country here for a 1 o'clock game. Ideally you're making other choices here. I have Melvin Gordon merely as a flex play. He made the hate list this week as well. I think you'll see some more for Royce Freeman. Stefania referenced that earlier. No offense, a special player. And so you may not have a better option at tight end, but lower expectations for the Broncos offense as a whole.
I thought that maybe Devontae Parker would sit this week, Stefania, a hamstring issue that's sort of been bothering him now. He is officially active for the Dolphins. Do you have confidence in this player lasting the entire game?
Why would I when he didn't last the entire last week's game? And I'm a little concerned as they play again on Thursday night. Devontae Parker, as you mentioned, Field, had the hamstring injury coming into week 1, but reportedly felt good. He plays, then we see him out early because of that hamstring issue, was questionable throughout the week. And interestingly, Brian Flores, after I think it was Thursday's practice, just said he hadn't been doing much. Now, you can not be doing much in practice because you're sort of saving up for the week, but we always talk about these hamstring injuries. It's like you never really feel confident that a guy is past the injury until you see him get through a full game without a setback. Haven't seen that yet, so I'm still a little nervous about Parker.
Rightfully so, because, by the way, in addition to the fact that not 100% healthy, going to face Tre'Davious White. He's most likely going to be shadowed by White, one of the best corners in the NFL. I actually think this upgrades the prospects of Preston Williams Field because Parker will take White out of the equation. And so you don't feel great about any of the Miami offense, honestly, based on what we saw last week. I mean, Fitzy he looked more like Fitztragic than Fitzmagic last week. And this Bills defense is for real. But I think if I had to start a Dolphins wide receiver today, and ideally I'm not, give me Preston Williams over Devontae Parker. Parker makes me nervous with the matchup and the injury and the quarterback play.
Players that were off the injury report, so it wasn't a concern about whether they would play or not, but just how much they'll play, included James Conner and Miles Sanders. Of course, they're both active, Stefania, but what do you expect workload-wise for these two banged up but talented running backs?
I think I feel differently about them, and here's why. Miles Sanders had the hamstring issue that kept him out of week 1, but we heard very encouraging things. He was almost there. They were making a proactive decision, and then he had this additional week, full practice every day, and we did hear Sapal earlier say he wasn't sure how much workload they'd get. Now, that might be a team decision, kind of see how the flow goes during the game, but I feel pretty good about his health based on all of those things. James Conner suffers an ankle injury, and we see him basically taken out in the first half of Monday night's game, and then doesn't really do much until Friday's practice. Now he's a go. You know, he expressed frustration. You feel badly for him. He's well aware that getting hurt just sort of feeds to the critics that say he can't stay on the field. But the fact is, he hasn't been able to stay on the field. And if you're Pittsburgh, are you looking at the performance of Benny Snell and looking at the injury risk of James Conner and saying, we're going to use an insurance mode here and go by committee?
Yeah, I want no part of Pittsburgh. I want no part of that Pittsburgh backfield until we get sent. I mean, like, you don't feel good about James Conner, who could leave the game early. You don't feel good about Benny Snell because it could be the James Conner show. Like, it just,
Yeah, there's certainly some uncertainty in that Pittsburgh backfield, but Benny Snell did run great last week. It's time for us now to go to the man who has all of the answers. Of course, that is Adam Schefter. And Shefty, Monday Night Football will be a great evening for Allegiant Stadium making its debut, but Saints wide receiver Michael Thomas will not be there. What's the latest information you have regarding his timeline of coming back from that ankle injury?
Well, Phil, the interesting part is that he made more progress this week than they thought he would initially when he suffered that mild high ankle sprain. Now, the interesting part here also, of course, is that they play in Green Bay next week, and the Packers team doctor is Dr. Robert Anderson. Dr. Robert Anderson was the one that examined Michael Thomas's MRI this past week, and he will get his hands on Michael Thomas this upcoming week. So it will be up to the Packers team doctor, perhaps, to make a determination about whether Michael Thomas is good enough to go up against his Packers team next week. But I think there's some optimism that Thomas could be back for that game.
Yeah, the other major fantasy injury today, of course, was George Kittle, who did not travel with the 49ers. How soon might he be back in the mix for them?
I'm told he will be back next week. That's the expectation. Now, you have to see how the week goes, but he's got a sprained medial collateral ligament in that knee. That's an injury that would sideline most players a few weeks, but George Kittle is not just any player. He's a different player. And so I would think that he will be back next week. And by the way, the 49ers will be back in the same stadium they're playing this week, playing the Giants. The Jets are fortunate enough not to get Kittle this week, but it sounds like the Giants won't have that great fortune next week.
Shefty, in your War Room League lineup, you have Russell Gage, who just went off for the Falcons last week. What's your confidence in his role staying consistent this week against the Cowboys?
Listen, he's averaged over 7 targets a game over the last 10 games. So this figures to be a high-scoring game in Dallas against the Cowboys. And so, frankly, if he's getting all those targets and they're playing catch-up, as they might be in Dallas today, I would hope and think that Russell Gage will do that again. I don't know that he's going to go for 20 fantasy points a week, but if he can get me double digits today, I'm good with that. And he's been doing that consistently over the last 10 or so games, Field.
All right, Shefty, we always like to have some fun with the long shots. And who might be your long shot for this week? A player who's off the radar who could perform.
Well, this week we'll go with Steven Sims, the Washington football team wide receiver that Matthew Berry likes so much. And here's a guy that has played very well. You figure this could be another game where there's some high-scoring action here. And I think Steven Sims is a guy that last year really came on. Looks like he's going to play well. Didn't light it up the first week, but I think could have a pretty good week this week.
That's a nice pick there. Just to be honest, Shefty, I learned about Steven Sims 2 weeks ago from Katie Camlin, but good to see that you're staying on the ball there. Matthew, how about your pick for the long shot in week 2?
Yeah, how about Mo Alley Cox, who's going to start at tight end for the Indianapolis Colts with Jack Doyle out. Trey Burton obviously hurt as well. Since 2015, Phillip Rivers averages over 7 attempts per game to tight ends since 2015. He is top 10 in attempts, completions, yards, touchdowns to tight ends. You love the matchup with a Vikings defense that certainly didn't look ready for prime time last week. Mo Alley-Cox, I believe, is 7'8". He just looks like he's a massive human being. And so a big red zone target for Phillip Rivers. Give me some Mo Alley-Cox, who I have as a top 20 tight end today.
All right, interesting names. Mo Alley-Cox on the board for Matthew and Steven Sims Jr. For Shefty. Shefty, good luck in your matchups today. And everybody, do yourself a favor. Turn on your Shefty Twitter notifications. All right, so Michael Thomas is out on Monday, as Shefty mentioned, and it sounds like he is a speedy recovery. Let's talk about Monday Night Football, though, in Week 2. We'll talk about Michael Thomas and his timeline. Plenty of time to break it down. But do we think that somebody is bound to step up in his absence here on Monday Night Football? And who might it be if you had to pick one player?
I don't really know who takes the place of a Michael Thomas out there. I mean, do you see more with Drew Brees throwing a lot of intermediate passes? Do you see the middle of the field get worked a little bit more? I mean, Alvin Kamara actually can absorb some passes without a Michael Thomas. I think you could spread it around there. Are we going to see a little more Taysom Hill in some gadget plays that they have for us in that game? What do you think, Matthew?
So I think if you're giving me who gets the biggest bump in value, look, Jared Cook had a nice game last week. I think Emmanuel Sanders gets the biggest bump. I have Emmanuel Sanders, as a top 20-ish wide receiver in this game. Like, it's a nice matchup here. Emmanuel Sanders very quietly had 4 red zone targets in week number 1, so they were looking for him. Drew Brees was looking for him, just wasn't able to connect with him. But now an extra day of practice, obviously, because it's the Monday night game, and they knew early on that they weren't going to have Michael Thomas this week, or that he would at least likely be limited. So my expectation is they've worked on some extra packages and extra work with Emmanuel Sanders. But I think Stefania's right that, look, this is a team, the Saints are, that they're heavy favorites in this game. I think they actually go more run heavy. I'm in a 16-team league where I have James Conner. I want no part of that Pittsburgh backfield, so I am actually starting at running back Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray in that 16-team league, because I actually think both guys get a significant amount of run. Murray got 15 carries last week. I don't think people realize that. So could they go more run heavy? Could they go more run heavy, more conservative? To your point, Stefania, you see some Taysom Hill, Jared Cook, Traquan Smith. They'll probably take a couple of deep shots to Traquan Smith. But in terms of actionable fantasy advice, you're starting Jared Cook, you're starting Kamara. I think Murray is a flex play option here. Traquan Smith is a boom-bust wide receiver 4, depending on your league needs. And I do think Emmanuel Sanders is worth putting in your lineup this week.
All right, let's look at some of the inactives from the early games today. And, of course, besides Michael Thomas, the biggest injury of the week could well be 49ers tight end George Kittle, who you see there on the inactive list. So the 4 players on the top of the screen are the guys that you might have room for in your lineup. Let's revisit that George Kittle injury, Stefania, based off your sense of, although he could travel and play next week, how concerned are you about George Kittle going forward with that knee injury?
I'm a little concerned. I just hope everyone does the right thing here, because George Kittle is a player, much like Michael Thomas, who's going to want to push to play. And the 49ers know that he played through a knee hyperextension injury last year. But if you guys recall, he struggled at times. I mean, he was definitely not 100%. They're playing on a turf stadium. That's always a little bit more problematic when you're first coming off injury. Adam reported that he has an MCL injury, but I want you guys to think about this. When you think of a classic MCL, you think of a sideways and, kind of takes out that ligament on the inside of the knee, stresses it that way. He had a hyperextension. That hits the back corner of the knee. There are other problems that come up with that, and you can have lingering swelling. You can get a little bone bruise in there. We don't know the details, but I would hope that George Kittle has no swelling, no pain, that they really let it resolve, because if not, we're going to be talking about George Kittle every week the rest of the season, and I don't want that to be the case.
I don't want that to be the case either. But, Matthew, there's another tight end injury that has some positive news. Gerald Everett for the Rams is active. Certainly not the same fantasy superstar or anywhere close as George Kittle, but there's an impact on Tyler Higbee. Quiet week 1 for Higbee, who was the star amongst tight ends down the stretch late last season. Do you have enough confidence based off what you saw either in week 1 or just what you saw last year that Higbee is a must start at tight end? Because there was some optimism going into this season that he could carry over some of that 2019 magic.
I think so. I mean, listen, it's nice for the Rams that they have Everett, but Higbee's going to be their guy. It's a great matchup with Philadelphia. And sort of you think about how this game might play out, right? I mean, so Philadelphia struggles against tight ends traditionally. They struggled last week. Obviously, Logan Thomas gets into the end zone, had a nice game for Washington. And by the way, so Darius Slay is probably going to be on Robert Woods and shadow him. They're good in slot coverage. The Eagles are, and so does my little Cooper Kupp have a down week as well. And so where are you looking? You're starting to look at Tyler Higbee. So I have Higbee as a top 10 fantasy play this week at the tight end position. The Everett news is nice for Everett and for the Rams, but as far as my fantasy analysis, it doesn't affect it.
Okay, interesting stuff there, but we do know about a player that's not going to be available on Monday night. That's Michael Thomas. Who stands to benefit the most from his absence in that New Orleans offense? We'll discuss that and more fallout from Monday Night Football next on Fantasy Football Now. It starts with Monday Night Countdown at 6. Let's get to some tweets. We love to be interactive here on Fantasy Football Now, and the first one comes from Catherine Hargrave Boyce, who addresses this one to all of us.
Okay.
Quarterback dilemma, Jimmy G or Wentz? Maybe the waiver wire, but I feel it is too early to give up on either. I'm not feeling good about either matchup today for multiple reasons. Matthew, I give this one to you first then. Jimmy G or Wentz or hit the waiver wire?
Well, without knowing who's on her waiver wire.
Speaking generally.
Yeah, I'll go with Wentz. Look, Wentz made the hate list, right, obviously? Look, Wentz made the hate list this week. Look, the offensive line is banged up, obviously. Aaron Donald and the Rams, we know they like to bring pressure. But getting Miles Sanders back, I think, will help that offense quite a bit and open up some of the passing lanes there. Expect this to be a high-scoring game, and I expect Wentz to play better, to be honest. Like, it's an over-under of 47, so it's like, I think it's going to be a bit of a high-scoring game here. Look, I get it with Jimmy G. It's obviously a good matchup with the Jets defense that has struggled so far this year, but who's he throwing to, Stefania? Listen, I know you like Brandon Ayuk, and I do too as well.
I like him. I like Brandon Ayuk, but I did not like what I saw necessarily from the offense as a whole. No George Kittle, and yeah.
Right. And no Deebo Samuel. So for me, I think Wentz is the call here as well. Somebody will step up for the Niners, but hard to know who.
Carson Wentz, all the way around for each of us. Stefania, this next question goes to you from D-Rock41. CeeDee Lamb, Corey Davis, or Cole Beasley with Josh Allen at quarterback. I got to tell you what, too much hate for Josh Allen. This guy was the only player, had his first ever 300-yard passing game last week. He looked great for the Bills, even with a couple of
I have Josh Allen at QB3 this week. Okay. Like, I'm moving him ahead of Dak, obviously. But I mean, QB3.
This is a question about his players, not necessarily him. So
to get to D-Rock's question.
Of course, we know Corey Davis was on the injury report this week.
Yes, but I'm not worried about him. I think Corey Davis, this was one of those, sometimes it's a little bit of a proactive move to have you on the injury report. Came in, didn't practice on Wednesday, limited Thursday, but upgraded to full on Friday. Look, I think they knew they were going to have to require a bigger workload, bigger target share from Corey Davis, who I thought looked pretty good in week one. But A.J. Brown out with the bone bruise, probably for multiple weeks. So I like Corey Davis.
Okay, Corey Davis. I would pick Corey Davis as well there out of those three options. This one comes from Ethan3159. Peyton Barber or Joshua Kelly have a bad problem in RB2 with Le'Veon Bell hurt this week, and those are the two options. Man, I would go with Peyton Barber, and here's the reason why. I'm nervous about the game script for Josh Kelly this week. They play the Chargers, the Chiefs. First game at SoFi Stadium for the Chargers, not sure it matters. The Chiefs could be up big in this game early, and Josh Kelly is not a receiving threat. That's what Austin Eckler is. So I don't know that he'll see the 12 carries and a touchdown that he did last week. I would go with Peyton Barber. Even as ugly as it was last week, he found his way to the end zone on two separate occasions.
Yeah, he did, and he got 17 carries. So, the volume of work is definitely going to be there for Peyton Barber. Will it be successful? Who knows? It was certainly ugly last week, but I agree with you, Field, here.
Yeah, so we are getting close to the. By the way, whenever you agree with me, that's how you know you're smart man here, Mr. Matthew Berry. We all agree.
I thought you were going a different way.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah,
I was waiting for that.
I'm keeping you guys on your toes, that's all. The best part of the show is when we have the opportunity to rank. So let's get into it. Let's rank our quarterbacks as we are just over 1 hour from kickoff.
Go!
We start with quarterbacks, and Matthew, in 1 through 10, you just mentioned him a moment ago, you've got Josh Allen, who has slid up to quarterback 3
Yeah, I moved him ahead of Dak Prescott with the Smith news. Look, here's a guy that led the Buffalo Bills in carries in week 1. He had 14 of them. Think about the Dolphins last week, who gave up 75 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground to Cam Newton. In his 4 career games against the Miami Dolphins, Josh Allen is averaging Field 31.1 fantasy points per game. Said multiple passing touchdowns in all 4 games. I loved what the Bills did offensively last week. Allen played great. They went 4 wide on a number of occasions. I don't think Miami has the personnel to stay up with Josh Allen. I think he has a monster game. He's my QB3 for the week. Give me all the Josh Allen today.
You mentioned you moved him ahead of Dak Prescott. Well, that's fine, but I still have Dak Prescott as my quarterback 4 for the week. The Falcons have been a great defense for opposing quarterbacks to face. Since the start of 2019, they've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. They've allowed 2/3 of passes to be completed. They've had the 4th fewest sacks, even with the protection concerns the Cowboys do have with no Tyron Smith. I do think that Dak Prescott finds his way to a huge, huge day against the Atlanta Falcons. Let's go back to you, Matthew, and let's talk about Cam Newton. That's right, he cracks the top 10 just barely. He plays the Seahawks. Concerned at all about the Patriots playing from behind in this game?
Look, that's always a little bit of a concern. Cam does play better when he's leading than when he's behind. Having said that, we know that Cam, when healthy, is a fantasy superstar. Guess what? Cam is currently healthy. Nice matchup here with Seattle in terms of the fact that the Seahawks were the 5th worst goal-to-go defense last year. They allowed the Falcons to convert both times in week 1 in goal-to-go situations, and obviously Cam Newton is as good as it gets when you get in close. We saw him convert twice last week. We saw him have 25 fantasy points in week 1. By the way, since he came into the NFL, no player, not quarterbacks, no player in the NFL has more rushing touchdowns in goal-to-go situations than Cam Newton since he came into the NFL. I have him as a top 8 play today.
All right, between 11 through 20, my quarterback pick of note is Ryan Tannehill. Played pretty well last week. He had 43 attempts in week 1. Interesting that he played well.
Interesting that he's your quarterback pick of all these guys on this list. I'm interested to hear why.
Because I don't want to go with the same names that I always go with every other week. And let's talk some positive about Ryan Tannehill, who has 22 fantasy points per game since taking over as a starter last year in week 7. 9.1 yards per attempt in that time. That's the best in the NFL. He's got 24 passing touchdowns, and even with no A.J. Brown, I do think he finds a way to move the football effectively against this Jaguars defense that, although it did play well last week, not quite ready to slow down this Titans offense this week. For those that are desperate, maybe looking at the waiver wire, perhaps in a 2-quarterback league, I do think it's worth pointing out Jared Goff. And Jared Goff, I thought, played well and efficiently for the Rams this past Sunday night. Now they go to the Eagles, who have a much improved secondary, but you mentioned the over-under being at, 47 points for this game, Matthew?
Yeah.
You could see maybe not a shootout, but at least a semi-shootout. Here are some other quarterbacks that are available in 50% or more of leagues. A note on Daniel Jones. For the first time ever, he will have Saquon Barkley, Evan Ingram, Golden Tate, Darius Slayton, and Sterling Shepard, all healthy and active. Phillip Rivers looking to bounce back after that week 1 loss against the Jacksonville Jaguars. All right, so we talked about this one on the podcast throughout the week. If you feel inclined, go ahead and download the podcast. Subscribe to it as well wherever you get your podcast. If you give us a 5-star ratings review on iTunes,
Field will come to your house.
Yeah, and make all your picks.
Outside the house.
Socially distant
High
five.
Yeah.
Which is maybe sort of possibly not possible. Anyways, we talked about Aaron Rodgers all throughout the week and whether he should be a lock-it-in top 10 quarterback this week. And you look at some of the signs that point in his favor. He was great last week. Yeah. Not just his number 2, but his number 2 and number 3 wide receivers played awesome. And I don't know which one's the number 2 because both Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Allen Lazard were great. Devontae Adams says Devontae Adams. And you've got the Lions, who are dealing with an injury to Desmond Trufant. Justin Coleman went on IR. They had multiple defensive starters who are also inactive for the week today. Nick Williams included amongst them, their defensive tackle. Matthew, should he be right back in starting lineups this week?
Yeah, 100%. He made the love list this week, which, listen, last week I had him on the hate list.
Can't win them all.
Hey, last week I had him on the hate list, made me look stupid. Nice job by Aaron Rodgers. Minnesota did not show up. And Minnesota's defense, I think, better than Detroit's. I mean, Detroit did not look ready for prime time. Mitchell Trubisky had a very nice game against the Lions secondary last week. And so Aaron Rodgers at home in Lambeau, who traditionally plays very well against the Lions, should have a field day here. No pun intended.
Field day.
Yeah, field day. We should do something about that. We should do there should be a who's going to have a field day. We should do a segment called that.
I like that idea. Field day, field pass, thoughts from the field, notes from the field. We'll figure something
He's been
out.
thinking about it.
We should do a whole pun.
We should more than enough time thinking about this one.
100%.
By the way,
but yes, Aaron Rodgers, a clear no-brainer top 10 play for me today.
Hate to cut you off, but I want to pass along word. We are 1 hour until kickoff of the early game.
Here we go.
1 hour until you get to spend the rest of your Sunday, glorious Sunday, watching football from the couch. Thanks to all those that are watching here, Fantasy Football Now. Let's get into wide receiver rankings, and we go to the top. Stephania Mike Evans cracks our top 10, and the good news is healthy Mike Evans.
Yes, healthy Mike Evans. And I think, we always talk about being a little nervous when guys are coming in the week after a hamstring injury. How worried should you be? But Mike Evans, he dabbled last week. Now, we heard that Bruce Arians said he didn't feel like he looked limited when he played last week, but they also controlled what they did for him. They acknowledged that they limited his routes, they limited what he was going to do on the field. Little bit of miscommunication here and there with him and Tom Brady as well. But as far as the hamstring goes, back practicing this week, and they feel very confident about his health going into this game. So I do too, based on those things.
Matthew, pardon the pun. I feel like this is something you would say. Are you feeling today with Adam Thielen against the Colts? And be honest, you know this.
Stephania, I need a ruling here. Was that an insult at me? Or is that it was an apology, but it felt like a jab?
You know what it is? Fields so young, he doesn't remember the song Hooked on a Thielen.
Hooked on a Thielen, that's right. Look, and Boomer, that's one of Boomer's nicknames, NFL Primetime Great on ESPN Plus. I'm a company man. Adam Thielen is my wide receiver 6 for the week. Field 32% target share in week number 1. Not a typo. 32% target share. Find yourself somebody that looks at you the way Kirk Cousins looks at Adam Thielen. When he sees 8 or more targets, this is a guy who averages over 21 fantasy points per game. Look, and the Colts, in a surprising loss to Jacksonville last week, allowed 3 touchdowns to wide receivers. They allowed a 93% catch rate. Since the start of 2019, they've allowed the second highest catch rate. So, in a game in which we expect Indy to be able to move the ball, so the Vikings are going to have to throw to keep up with the Colts, Adam Thielen is going to get a ton of looks. Again, my wide receiver 6, and somebody that I think is very much worth the price in daily.
This wide receiver injury kind of flew under the radar, Stephania, and maybe not a major concern, but what do you know on Amari Cooper?
Dealing with a bruised foot. That's why he was limited in practice late in the week, but full practice Friday and off the injury report, so nothing overly concerning for the Cowboys with their wide receiver.
Okay, no obvious concerns or overwhelming concerns for Amari Cooper, so I get to talk about him now. In week 1, he led the team in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and air yards percentage. That was a bad match. Remember, Jalen Ramsey. This just in, Falcons fans, earmuff it for a second. Your cornerbacks are not Jalen Ramsey. They got torched this past week in a very young and inexperienced group that will find its way. But for now, I expect Amari Cooper to have a great game for the Dallas Cowboys. All right, we pushed things forward there from the top 10 to the 11 through 20, but Calvin Ridley's actually snuck back inside the top 10 that same game against the Dallas Cowboys since week 5 of last year. He's averaging 18.2 fantasy points per game. That's wide receiver 6 overall. And he stacks up favorably to his teammate, the alien Julio Jones. Look at that in terms of yards per reception, air yards per target. And in week 1, both of them had 9 catches. Each one had at least 130 receiving yards. But it was Ridley who found the end zone twice. The Cowboys put Anthony Brown on IR yesterday. It's not just offensive line injuries, it's also injuries in the secondary. Stay in the same game. And Matthew, we've been discussing the Cowboys offense with no Tyron Smith, but not enough to move Michael Gallup out of your lineups.
I love Michael Gallup. And, look, ticky-tack offensive pass interference call last week. I think his game and box score would have looked a lot different had that call not been made. Falcons secondary certainly doesn't scare you. They allowed the 4th most yards to wide receivers in week 1, as anyone who started DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett is well aware. Since the start of last season, Falcons allowing 15.5 yards per reception to wide receivers lined up wide. So Michael Gallup, who does line up wide quite a bit. My expectation here is, yes, even with Tyron Smith out, I still believe this is going to be a good offense, an explosive game between the Cowboys and the Falcons. And Michael Gallup, who I have as wide receiver 13 this week, is somebody that needs to be in your lineup.
Okay, let's go right back to you, Matthew. Monday Night Football, of course, no Michael Thomas, but we will see Emmanuel Sanders, who had a pretty good game for the Saints last week. You think he can step up in Thomas's absence?
I do. Look, I referenced it earlier. This is a guy that led all players, with 4 red zone targets in week number 1. Raiders allowing the 8th highest completion percentage in the red zone since the start of 2019. Look, they allowed the 7th most fantasy points and 6th most yards to wide receivers in week 1. Even though the Raiders won last week, Carolina pass catchers had a really nice day against the Raiders here. And so Drew Brees is going to have to throw it to somebody. And they're going to throw it. Look, you got Jared Cook. You do have Kamara out of the backfield. But I think Emmanuel Sanders, who's already gotten some looks, and we've seen it before when he came over to the 49ers last year midseason, he is a quick learn. He is a professional, a pro's pro. I think Emmanuel Sanders has a very nice game this week. He comes in as wide receiver 18 for me, so just inside my top 20.
We keep it rolling here with you, Matthew Berry. Deontay Johnson had that fumble early in week 1, but then bounced back. You like him against the Denver Broncos.
Yeah, I really do. Look, he was targeted on 33% of his routes last week. That was tied for the 6th highest rate among wide receivers who ran at least 20 or more routes. In that game, he got 11 targets in week 1. And did they connect in a big way? They didn't. But look, Denver secondary, again, we've talked about this game a lot over the show. Broncos traveling cross country on a short week. A.J. Boye not going to play in this game here. So that's a hit to that Broncos secondary as well. Deontay Johnson, give me all the Deontay. I am his wide receiver 23 today. Broncos allowed 13 receptions to wide receivers lined up wide in week number 1, 147 yards. Those are not good stats unless you have Deontay Johnson on your team.
Sadly, the Ravens offense showed a bunch of signs of rust in week 1. No, just kidding. They actually steamrolled the Browns. The game was over by about the end of the first quarter, in part because Marquise Brown had 5 catches and 101 yards in the first half. And look at how he played last year, pre-injury and post-injury. Pre-injury, he was a star. He looked like that player pre-injury in week 1. 5 catches, 101 yards, a guy who's so explosive, so fast, and he put on 23 pounds of muscle this offseason. The rest of us just put on 23 pounds because quarantine. I like Marquise Brown to be a staple inside my lineup almost every single Sunday. Now, Stefania, we've got 3 injuries on this board right now. We begin with Courtland Sutton against the Steelers.
Yeah, Courtland Sutton suffering that AC sprain that kept him out of the week 1 Monday night game and really pushing to get back out at practice, but very limited this week. Never really getting that arm overhead when he was catching balls in practice. It might not be the biggest deal. You might be comfortable just seeing what a guy like Courtland Sutton could do, even in a limited situation, unless you're facing the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. I'd be really nervous about a guy who's less than 100% out on the field against the Steelers D.
How about Julian Edelman for the Patriots, who play later on tonight?
Yeah, not too worried about Julian Edelman, as he's sort of the Tom Brady on the injury report for me now, because Julian Edelman appears there a lot. They limit him in practice, not like he doesn't know the offense, and then he ends up playing. So despite his questionable tag, fully expect him to be available on
One more, good stuff there. One more is Devontae Parker for the Dolphins. Sorry to cut you off there a moment ago, Stefania. They play the Bills.
Yes, they do. And a little bit surprising. We talked about him with a hamstring issue that cut his week 1 game short. Limited in practice throughout the week. Brian Flores said he really didn't do much in practice, and maybe they were protecting him so that they could have him available. Dolphins play again in 4 days, so I'm worried not only about can he get through the game without a setback. We certainly didn't see that last week. And then how much are they going to use him? Are they going to be apprehensive at all, just given that they haven't seen him go 100% yet?
Early leader in real estate on Fantasy Football Now is Paris Campbell. We keep talking about him. A week 1 sleeper for Mike Clay. No longer a sleeper, as he led all Colts wide receivers, and skill players for that matter, with 61 snaps in week 1. He had 6 catches. They play the Vikings, who Mike already highlighted as a favorable wide receiver cornerback matchup. This is a player whose value could be on the way up, or all the way up, I should say, with good matchups ahead for Indianapolis, who really needs to right the ship. A reminder that Jonathan Williams will be the man in the backfield. Jonathan Taylor, I don't know why I said Jonathan Williams. He used to play for the Colts. Jonathan Taylor, now the man in the backfield for the Indianapolis Colts. All right, Stefania, a couple more names on this board in the 31 to 40 section. Henry Ruggs, they play Monday night. What's the latest on the Raiders rookie?
Yeah, I think this one kind of flew under the radar because Henry Ruggs sustained a knee injury during last week's game. but he was able to come back in the second half and play through that injury, something that John Gruden praised him for, said he's a tough kid and that he loved seeing him just work through it in that game. However, what happened was he didn't practice at all Thursday or Friday as a result. Now, he was back out doing a little bit of work on Saturday, but he comes in as questionable. It sounds like they think he will play, but I think your hints here are that he will not be at 100%.
All right, one more here, Stefania, is Brandon Cooks. Of course, the Texans are desperate for a win today against the Ravens. Might they have one of their best wide receivers available?
I think they probably will. We saw him last week, but he didn't look great. You know, we said don't expect too much, given that he was a game-time decision because of that quad strain. Still working on a limited basis. Yes, we expect that he will play, but I'm not convinced that he's 100% past this.
Okay, well, if you need to find some wide receivers at the last minute, here are some names that you need to know. These are players that are available in at least 50% of leagues. Mike Williams for the Chargers tops the list. You've got Mecole Hardman, and those Chiefs are becoming so useful in fantasy because you kind of know what you're getting from them. All starters, Mecole Hardman could be on the radar as a flyer. At the bottom of that list is Corey Davis, interesting player. He was added to the Irish Twins. That's my team, along with Matt Harrington. In the War Room League, 16-teamer at ESPN, and could potentially be a starter for us. Stefania, all these injuries, disconcerting for these wide receivers. Is this coincidence, or is there something to it, you think?
There is something to it. There's actually data that backs this up. I know a lot of times we say year in and year out, well, it just feels like there's more of these type of injuries. And we've been talking about especially the wide receivers. Well, your observations are, you're onto something. More hamstring injuries than any other year in the last decade heading into week one, almost double the number heading into week one, which isn't totally surprising if you think about how altered this offseason was with the COVID experience, people not having their regular conditioning programs. We thought this might be something, but my friends over at Proven Performance Technology tell me wide receivers lead all positions 3-1 in hamstring injuries right now. So certainly this year is basically an outlier, we think. It's hard to compare to other years because of all the different circumstances. But there's something real there. Okay, interesting to note. So hopefully these wide receivers either work themselves into football shape or that we can find ways to meander this early season dilemma.
And you look at those names, Field, like there's a very good chance the way the drafts went this year that you could have gone Michael Thomas and like Galladay or A.J. Brown in the third, right? Sure. Cortland Sutton in the fourth, like, right, and Crowder late. Like, you could have multiple of these. I'm in a 14-team keeper league where I have Godwin, Galladay, and Sutton out. Like, it's unbelievable.
Sort of a humble brag there. Like
a little bit. Did you notice that? I was just trying to sort of mention. I am the defending champion.
His opponent know, like,
I am the
if I don't win.
Trying to decide between Mahomes and Jackson.
I also have Lamar Jackson in that league. I am the defending champion. Okay. It's nice to mention.
No longer
that.
Everybody cares.
Listen, here's what I'm going to tell you. Listen, if I'm just going to tell people at home. If you ever get a national television show about fantasy football, absolutely mention your good lineups. There's no point in being on national TV talking fantasy football if you're not going to humble brag once in a while, Field. I'm just letting you know that.
We want them to stay with us, so we're going to move on.
Just
a heads up.
Humility is actually dead. I mentioned all these wide receivers with hamstring injuries. Good news is that Golden Tate is back after missing week one. And how about this? What a great way to honor two legends gone way too soon, as Golden Tate's cleats today will include Kobe Bryant and Chadwick Boseman, two just crushing, devastating losses in 2020. Of course, Boseman last month and Kobe in January. So an incredibly cool tribute. Wakanda forever, as Golden Tate shows, and awesome.
Wakanda forever, Mamba forever.
Wouldn't surprise me if Golden Tate has a great game today as the Giants look to get their first win of the season. All right, Todd Gurley managers are hoping for more of week one Todd Gurley in the first half, not so much the second half. What's it going to be? We'll talk running back rankings next on Fantasy Football Now. Football Now, and it's time to rank some running backs. We begin with Matthew Berry and Alvin Kamara. They play on Monday Night Football to the Saints, and man, he looked like a star running back, which he is in week one.
Yeah, look. We've talked about this game quite a bit, but Alvin Kamara is a superstar. Regardless of who's out there with him, the fact that there's no Michael Thomas, who's Drew Brees looking for? Probably looking for Alvin Kamara, the man who got paid recently since the start of last year Las Vegas has allowed the 6th most receiving yards to opposing running backs. Obviously, Kamara averages over 5 receptions a game for his career. In his career, when he has gotten at least 15 touches, and that's 30 career games, so we got a pretty big sample size here, Field. 22.7 fantasy points per game in the 30 career games, once again, with 15 or more touches. Certainly with Michael Thomas out and a game script that would favor the Saints, you would expect Kamara to get over 15 touches on Monday night.
I'm not old like you, but I'm old enough to remember when Derrick Henry had a 99-yard touchdown run against the Jacksonville Jaguars. There's a case for him as the RB1 of the week. He had 100% of the Titans' carries in week 1. And the Jaguars allowed over 50 fantasy points to opposing running backs in week 1. Since 2019 started, they're only behind the Panthers in terms of most fantasy points per game allowed to opposing running backs. Derrick Henry is going to have a great game today. I mistakenly called him Jonathan Williams earlier because, well, apparently I have some preseason rust to knock off. I actually meant Jonathan Taylor. He's the Colts star running back, Matthew, and he's now their starting running back as well. You like him against the Vikings?
Yes. Yeah, significantly so. You never want to root for injuries. You always hate to see it. Brutal break for Marlon Mack. But what that does do is open the door even more significantly for Jonathan Taylor, who I have as a top 10 play today. What was really encouraging last week about Taylor, and we saw the size, we saw the speed, the vision, all the reasons why he was such a highly thought of prospect coming out of college. But what was amazing was the 6 for 67 on 6 targets in the passing game. 47% of Philip Rivers' completions went to running backs last week, Field, and obviously Nyheim Hines is going to be heavily involved. But the Vikings, who allowed 4.96 yards per carry to running backs in week 1, 5th highest in the NFL. If Jonathan Taylor is not only going to get the goal line work and get the stuff between the 20s, but he's also going to be involved in the passing game, sky's the limit for this kid. I have him as a top 10 play today, and honestly, I might not be high enough.
The 49ers have all sorts of injuries, but the good news is they do have Raheem Mostert in the backfield. He looked like the best player in their offense this past week. Raheem must start, says Matthew Berry. He started seeing an expanded workload in week 12 of last year. If you include the playoffs, in his past 10 games, 6.4 yards per carry and wins with nearly 2 touchdowns per game, and the 49ers are favored in this game. He was also great as a receiver this past Sunday. He had the fastest time for a ball carrier, 22.76 miles per hour, according to Next Gen Stats, as any player since 2016, when a young Tyreek Hill was just a little bit faster than Raheem Mostert. He is a must-start this week. Matthew, the Buccaneers' backfield has been confusing already so far this season, but it feels like it's a good matchup if somebody's going to emerge. Are you confident that Ronald Jones, can be the man this week?
Confidence is a strong word. Do I think maybe, possibly, he could be? Yeah, sure, sort of, possibly. Look, Jeff Darlington talked about it earlier in the show that we're going to see Leonard Fournette be a big part of this offense. Whether it happens today or not remains to be seen. The matchup is certainly right against Carolina. Since the start of last year, they've allowed the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, the most rushing touchdowns, and the highest yards per carry allowed as well in that span. Josh Jacobs got them for 3 scores last week, so you couldn't ask for a better matchup. And obviously, Ronald Jones, who saw 73% of the running back touches in week 1, looks to be the guy. You just never, ever know. And look, there were some things that needed to be cleaned up last week. Brady was not happy with that offense as a whole, and Jones is part of that. I'm his running back 18 this week, so my expectation is he gets into the end zone here, but confident is not a word I would use. Cautiously optimistic is what I would say about Ronald Jones today.
Okay, well, you're showing some confidence with that fuchsia tie and pocket square look. I like it, Matthew.
Thank you. Listen, anytime you can get a fashion compliment from Field Yates, you take it.
All right, we'll take it indeed. Let's talk about running backs in the 21 to 30 range. Malcolm Brown, we opened the show with Sal Powell telling us a little bit about what it's going to look like in that Rams backfield against the Eagles today. But here's the good news. If you're playing Malcolm Brown, it's because you figure he can't not be the man after what he did last week. He had 21 touches. He had 110 scrimmage yards. He had a career high 26 fantasy points and 2 touchdowns. So really encouraging signs from Malcolm Brown. I think eventually this backfield splits up a little bit more, but for a game that the Rams certainly could use because that NFC West is no joke, you got to figure they stay with the guy that ran so effectively this past Sunday night against the Dallas Cowboys. All right, Matthew, J.K. Dobbins found the end zone twice for the Ravens, but I still think there are questions about whether that was, well, they were blowing the Browns out, or if this is already a committee between he and Mark Ingram.
We talked at the top of the show about backfields we wanted to watch, and we wanted some clarity in Tampa Bay, in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in Washington. And I would add Baltimore to that list. You're absolutely right, Field. Look, J.K. Dobbins led the Baltimore Ravens backfield in snaps in week 1. He outsnapped Ingram 12-11 in the first half when it was a little bit closer. He got 2 goal-to-go carries and converted both. So all those things are great. But Mark Ingram is still there. Lamar Jackson is always a threat to run it himself. They could also pass. And then, by the way, do you see some Gus Edwards as well if they get up big? It's a little bit of a mess here. Texans have certainly struggled against running backs since the start of last year. They allowed the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. We saw Clyde Edwards-Helaire absolutely decimate them to start the season off. I have J.K. Dobbins at running back 31. You know I love his talent. I have him on a lot of rosters. He was a preseason darling of mine. I'm just not sure exactly what his role is, because is he definitely going to be the goal line back, or was that just game script and, Mark Ingram's going to be more involved than we think? So, yeah, this is a committee backfield, unfortunately. It's a great matchup, but I don't have confidence in him as anything other than a flex until we get more clarity.
One way the Saints might be able to account for Michael Thomas's absence is by running the football a bunch more. And Latavius Murray had 15 carries for the team in week 1. He also had 48 rushing yards. Both of those figures led the Saints. The rest of the team combined for just 19 rushes and 34 yards. And he is not your typical backup running back. He saw 9 or more touches in over half of his games last season. He had 10 games with multiple receptions as well. So if you prescribe to the theory that what the Saints might do this Monday is slow things down a bit, grind it out, and rely on a workhorse, which is what Latavius Murray can be, and he could be a player that merits consideration in your flex spot. Let's look at some of the notable available running backs. As always, I remind you the criteria is they're available in over 50% of leagues. Sony Michel actually ran pretty well for the Patriots, but they're crowded in the backfield. At the bottom of that list, you see Frank Gore, and I think just based off reputation alone, Stefania needs to be available in 0% of leagues.
That's right. And you know what? I'm going to make a little prediction today. I
All right.
think Frank Gore gets into the end zone against his former team, San Francisco 49ers.
I like that call. I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
Again, find somebody that looks at you the way that Adam Gase looks at Frank Gore.
Didn't you just say that about somebody else earlier on in the show?
about the way Kirk Cousins looks at Adam Thielen.
So does Kirk Cousins look at Adam Thielen the way that Adam Gase looks at Frank Gore, or vice versa?
Yes, both.
Both. Okay.
Both.
They found each other like the Spider-Man.
The Spider-Man meme, exactly.
Okay, there you go.
Exactly what that is.
Can we talk about Austin Eckler for a second? Austin Eckler.
Not for a second.
Had one.
Let's turn this into the Austin Eckler show. Let's go Austin Eckler and nothing but Austin Eckler for the rest of the way.
One of my favorite players in the NFL who had just one target in week 1. Now, I remind people, they were in this grinded out affair with the Bengals where it was close all game.
Yep.
Much more reliant on running the football than they might be today against the Chiefs. Matthew, you are ardent. You are passionate. You have planted your flag on this. Austin Eckler is going to bounce back in a major way. He's a buy low for you.
He is indeed. I love Austin Eckler, also one of my favorite players in the NFL, and a really good player. And I understand, people are like, oh, Tyrod doesn't check down the way Phillip Rivers does. And Anthony Lynn was quoted as saying that, those running back dump offs are not going to be as big a part of their offense. Okay, fine. I get all that. But I personally don't think Anthony Lynn and the Chargers coaching staff are idiots. I think they are smart football guys. I believe they're going to look at Austin Eckler and say, you know what? Here's one of the best pass-catching running backs in the NFL. You know what we should do? Let him catch some passes. Again, it wasn't volume of work. He got 19 carries. He got 19 carries in week 1 against Cincinnati. So it's not about the volume of work. It's just the kind of work. And we know, obviously, especially for PPR scoring, that you want it to be pass-catching. But in a game in which they're expected to trail, and potentially significantly, to the Kansas City Chiefs, look, if he doesn't catch any passes today, then we can go ahead and panic. But I'm not panicking just yet. He got tremendous usage. He's a focal point of that offense. For me, a running back in this day and age that gets 20 touches, which is what I believe Austin Eckler got in week 1 and caught one ball, right? And he had the 19 carries. Yeah, I'm in. And so I'm not worried about Austin Eckler. I still believe he is a low-end RB1 for the season.
A running back we've been discussing throughout the show, Stefania, that will make his debut is Miles Sanders. But there's a difference between debuting and being your normal self. What do you expect out of the Eagles running back?
I think the fact that they held him out last week, gave him that extra week, really helped him. He said this week that he feels 100% ready to go. They talked about him making really good progress last week, and it was questionable whether he might play up until the weekend. So I think I like Miles Sanders. We'll see how they utilize the running backs today. But yes, there's always, when you're first coming back, especially off a hamstring injury, there's sort of a flow to how is the running back responding in the course of the game. And obviously, if he feels something, he's going to get protected and come out early. But I'm not expecting that. I mean, everything leading up to this, the full practices all week, the way they held him out, the confidence that he has, I think he's good today.
The offensive line getting healthier as well, with Lane Johnson being back at right tackle. Let's go to your tweets. We love hearing from you, getting interactive. Always use the hashtag FFNow to ask your questions, which we can subsequently answer. Kaylee is our first question asker. She wants to know, do I start Melvin Gordon or Ronald Jones at RB2 this week? That's a great question, Matthew. So I'm going to make you answer the tough one here, because Melvin Gordon's got a terrible matchup, and Ronald Jones plays for the Buccaneers, and we've been thinking about it for the past 3 hours, and we still don't have an answer on who to trust.
No, we really don't. I guess here's what I would say to Kaylee, is it depends on kind of the player you are. I think Ronald Jones has the higher ceiling, and I think Melvin Gordon has the higher floor. I think in terms of total touches, I think Melvin Gordon gets more touches today.
Agreed.
Right? You'll see some Royce Freeman, but I think he gets more touches. But who's more likely to get into the end zone, which is a higher scoring game, which offense do I think performs better? I think it's Tampa Bay. The question on Ronald Jones is whether it's going to be him or Fournette. Does he catch passes? Does he catch from a pass from Brady here? I think if it were me, I think I would start Ronald Jones and not feel good about it. That's how I would. Again, because it's an upside play. What? No risk it, no risk it. No, the actual say is no risk it, no biscuit, but it's a long joke on the podcast. It's available wherever you get podcasts, the 0610. If you enjoy this, we do it 5 days a week during the week.
Brett Favre.
5 days a week during the week. Whatever.
And it's
whatever. We do it Monday through Friday.
Like that keep you coming
Get
back.
this man some coffee or something. Brett Favre in attendance for that game. I don't know. There are no fans allowed.
But I think this is a really interesting one.
That's why I asked you.
went right. No, I know. Yeah. But so I'm saying.
No, I agree. No, I think your logic is basically exactly how I would see it as well. I'm going with Ronald Jones. I think there's a chance that he is the guy that they score 38 points in this game today. Let's go to
Starfinder.
Yeah, reluctantly, like I said.
All the way around. Let's go to the next question here, which comes from AJ Andrew, who wants to pick one out of these three. The options are Mark Ingram, Myles Gaskin, Zach Moss, or DeAndre Swift. I'll start here. I think Mark Ingram has a much steadier workload today for the Ravens. I think that last week was certainly they played great and they got good contributions from Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews, and J.K. Dobbins found the end zone twice. I think last week was this game got out of hand early. Let's preserve the guy and Mark Ingram, who is a focal point for our team, but is a veteran who could use the rest early, especially when, as we've talked about, guys are still working themselves into playing shape. Different answers, either of you?
No. I mean, I'm looking at
I mean, like I said, I think Zach Moss gets in the end zone. DeAndre Swift could use, but yes, I think Ingram has the look. And by the way,
more reliable. Of all of that group, he's the most reliable in terms of what I.
And it's a great matchup with Houston, and after all the talk of J.K. Dobbins, you could see Coach Harbaugh saying like, oh no, I want Mark into the end zone this week.
Bonus question comes from Memphis Grizzlies point guard Tyus Jones at @1Tyus on Twitter. Wants to know Deshaun Watson or Cam Newton. People tweeted him to let him know what we say. Cam or Deshaun?
I'm still going Deshaun Watson.
Okay,
no, actually, you know what? I take that back. I want Cam Newton.
Okay.
Give me Cam Newton.
Yeah, I want Cam in Seattle.
Clean sweep. Go tweet @1Tyus to let him know. Cam is the man today. All right, as we know, no George Kittle this week. We have ideas to replace him, though, when we take a deep dive into tight ends next on Fantasy Football Now.
We're off to a good start from left B, but right B is cutting him off now. Left B.
Hey, stop, think fast. Whoa, hey. Whoa, hey, everybody, he caught it. I guess you could never play for the Lions.
Did another punt.
Let's go. I, Matthew Berry, single-handedly spurred Aaron Rodgers back to being a dominant fantasy quarterback. You are welcome.
Remember that clip of you running?
Your lungs are shut down, huh?
No, you stink at that.
Austin Eckler, one catch. Some PPR machine you are, you bum.
What the hell's going on with Terry McLaurin?
I do, Matthew.
What non-trademark character is that?
Oh, hey over there, Doc. And you're welcome for the second Calvin Ridley touchdown in garbage time.
That garbage touchdown cost me like in 3 different leagues.
Wow, cool story, bro.
Daniel Dopp absolutely crushes it on the fantasy show on ESPN+.
He does.
Let's talk about tight ends. No, I'm just kidding. Matthew is great as well. Find that show twice a week, at least, on ESPN+. Let's talk tight ends. And Matthew, we started the show, as I mentioned, with Sal Powell and tight end talk. As always, he's the whisperer. You like Dallas Goedert to keep up his red-hot start against the Rams.
I certainly do. It's a nice matchup with LA. Since the start of last season, Rams allowing a league-high 12.7 yards per reception to tight ends. Look, Jalen Reagor and Deshaun Jackson can have their hands full with Jalen Ramsey. They're still trying to find their way. That offense still goes through the tight ends here. And Dallas Goedert, who led the Eagles in targets, catches, and yards in week 1, is absolutely a top 10 play for me today. I have a tight end 7. You're obviously starting Ertz, but Goddard, who was a top 10 fantasy tight end last year, continuing what he did last season in week number 1. I think it continues today, too.
Good start for Hunter Henry last week against the Bengals. He now plays the Chiefs. He had 5 catches for 73 yards in week 1. He actually had 8 targets, which was one behind the team leader. He ranked 5th amongst tight ends in week 1 with 24% of the team's air yards. And, let's be honest. When it comes down to Hunter Henry, a lot of my logic is he's a good player. It's hard to find good tight ends. And even in a flawed passing offense, I believe that Hunter Henry will be a weekly lineup staple for you. All right, Matthew, the Cardinals last year were just devastated by tight ends. Could that keep up with Logan Thomas, your 1.01 going into the season?
I did a weird randomizer best ball draft, and so I had to take somebody from Washington with an ADP lower than 140 at 101. And I did choose Logan Thomas. You are correct, Field Yates. I love Logan Thomas. Been talked about him last week. I believe he was my prediction for who would make your waiver wire column this week. Talked him up last week, and he delivered. 3rd highest target share among all tight ends in week number 1. Obviously, you love the matchup with the Cardinals team, who since the start of 2019 has allowed the most fantasy points and touchdowns to opposing tight ends. They don't have a lot of weapons in Washington, but they do have one of them in Logan Thomas.
Stephania Bell, the family has great DNA. Her brother was just asking. Her brother's awesome about his flex considerations. And one of the names was TJ Hawkinson, who I suggest will be a good player in the lineup this week after a great performance in week 1. 5 catches, 56 yards, and a touchdown. The Packers also allowed 100% completion percentage to tight ends in week 1. He only ran 24 routes, did Hawkinson, in week 1. But that could be because they were playing with a lead for much of that game. Perhaps playing from behind today, TJ Hawkinson stays busy, and the Lions target him in the red zone. Again, let's look at available tight ends, and you might need one this week if you have someone like George Kittle on your roster. Mike Gesicki available in just over 50% of leagues. Chris Herndon over 60% of leagues, and Jonnu Smith on down in over 70% of leagues. Matthew, anybody here stand out that you maybe think could be a best available of these availables?
Well, Herndon's there's actually a lot of interesting guys there. I love Gesicki, just don't love him today against the Bills. Herndon, we've talked about. Mike Clay mentioned him as well. Obviously, there aren't a lot of other options in that Jets passing game. Jonnu Smith with A.J. Brown banged up. He's somebody that's pretty interesting there as well. So a lot of guys there that, there's a lot of good sort of later round tight ends. And I've already mentioned Mo Alley Cox is somebody that I like starting for Indy today in place of Jack Doyle.
Let's get into Noah Fant, who was
fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that.
You see the Broncos have embraced that. The Broncos official Instagram account tweeted a graphic exactly with that.
Did they credit you?
They did not. That's okay.
Have you considered saying something?
My lawyers are in touch with their lawyers. Well, it'll be fine. We'll get into it. It's fine.
Is incredible.
No,
well, at least they
it's fine. They understand. They appreciate greatness, just like I do. And Noah Fantastic is on board.
Is he in store for another great week this week against the Steelers? Because the Steelers were about as smothering as there was defensively in all of week 1.
No, I mean, look, they're going to have to move the ball somehow. And, Stefania talked earlier about Cortland Sutton and how banged up he is. And, we expect him to be somewhat limited as well. It was a mixed bag and debut for Jerry Jeudy in week 1. So my expectation here is that if you're starting a pass catcher for the Broncos, it's Noah Fant. But I don't know that I feel super confident. I'm a big believer in that entire Steelers defense. And you don't love the fact that the Broncos coming in less than 100% healthy, having to travel cross country on a short week, for a 1 o'clock game, West Coast team for a 1 o'clock game. So give me the Steelers. I'm actually, siding with the Steelers in this one.
I'm having a hard time deciding what I prefer more because I have a decent amount of exposure to Noah Fant, and I wanted to do well for my teams. But I would like to retire the fantastic moniker for at least a week. So maybe if he struggles, we can put that to bed until maybe week 4.
The fact that you have asked me to retire,
You know what happened.
I mean, how long have we worked together?
know.
It means I'm going to beat it into the
doomed,
ground.
Field.
It's just like such a rookie mistake, right, Stefania? Like, what's he doing?
Man, it's only my second week on this hosting job. I got a lot to learn. Stefania, let's revisit the top tight end injury of the day. Of course, it's your George Kittle. You expect him back in week 3, yes or no?
This smile, it's turning upside down. Look, I mostly because of the nature of the injury. George Kittle is tough. Look, he probably wanted to go this week. And Kyle Shanahan left the door open for George Kittle to potentially even play this week. Adam Schefter reporting this morning he has a sprained MCL. Again, I've talked about this already. If you look at the injury, it's more like a hyperextension, so kind of a posterior medial direction. Why does that matter? Because it seems more problematic to me in terms of what could go on with his knee. They're also the team staying in West Virginia, so they are staying east for the game next week when they will face the Giants, obviously against Jets today. Turf, traveling to the East Coast. He is expected to travel out there sometime this weekend or tomorrow, but if the swelling persists and the discomfort persists, I just don't see them putting him back on the turf right away.
I mean, even if he doesn't play, I'd make the trip to the Green Bar. That place is awesome in West Virginia.
It's haunted, isn't it? The athletes who stay there talk about the ghosts.
Well, they've got great golf there, too, so that might be worth the trip on its own. Let's talk about defenses quickly before we move on. Matthew, you start. You have the Saints against the Raiders on Monday Night Football. The Saints shut down Tom Brady. Can they do it again on Monday night?
Yeah, all due respect to Derek Carr, he ain't Tom Brady.
Prove it.
3 turnovers in week 1. They're 3rd in pressure percentage and 6th in sack rate since the start of 2019. I don't know why you hate Tom Brady, Field Yates, but I'm a believer. I'm a believer. That's maybe what it is. You one of those bitter Patriot fans?
How about the Steelers? Talking about their defense, T.J. Watt had an interception last week, and then Cam Hayward had one later as well. They were one of 3 teams with multiple sacks and multiple interceptions in week 1. They allowed 1.5 yards per carry, including 18 inches per carry to Saquon Barkley. That's right, he had 6 total yards. Matthew, how about Washington, your football team against the Cardinals?
8 sacks in week 1, 10th highest pressure rate. That front 7 is legit. And you think about last year, the 49ers. I'm not saying the Washington football team is the 49ers from last year.
Good.
But think about that. Think about how dominant that defense was last year, and it all started up front. Like, you can mask a poor secondary if you can get to the quarterback before he can throw it. If you can get to the quarterback before he can throw it, it doesn't matter if you can guard guys in the secondary or not. And I think that's Washington's strategy this year. So they're going to be aggressive quite a bit. And so Kyler Murray, who took some sacks last week, I know he is mobile, obviously. But, yeah, I like the Washington defense as a streamer this week. I'm at defense 13 if you're looking outside the top 10.
I like the Rams against the Eagles because of Aaron Donald. That's my analysis. Aaron Donald, that's it. Aaron Donald. Get the Rams defense if you're looking for a potential streaming option. A couple of notable available teams include the Buccaneers, Chiefs, Cardinals. Really like their schedule coming up. Titans, who were stout defensively last week. And then Matthew just mentioned the Washington football team. While we are no Jeff Darlington dad, we will spend next segment flexing on you. That's right, Flex Appeal next on Fantasy Football Now.
The hashtag FFNow is trending in America. Thank you very much. People use that hashtag to send us their flex questions. Field Yates, for week number 2. Tons of names came at us. You and I got together before the show. We looked at all the names. The 10 names that came at us the most are here on the screen behind us. And so we ranked them 10 through 1. Start us off with number 10.
By the way, further evidence that Stefania is an internet sensation with FFNow trending. Sammy Watkins had a great week in week 1. He did the same thing last year in week 1 as well. I believe he was wide receiver 1 in week 1 of 2019. My concern is that over his past 15 games, he also has 9 games in which he had single-digit fantasy points. You love Chiefs in general in your lineup, but a little bit nervous that Sammy Watkins might have had some magic in week 1 that won't be back in week 2.
Certainly a real fear based on past history and so many weapons that they have in Kansas City. Anthony Miller comes in at number 9. Now, the positives for Anthony Miller is that he finished last year strong, had that stretch where he was just unstoppable, and last week led the Bears with 76 receiving yards. He caught an end zone target for a touchdown. However, he only ran 21 routes on 39 different Trubisky dropbacks. Want to see him on the field a little bit more, but I do expect them to be able to move the ball against the Giants. Who's number 8?
Number 8 is Tyler Higbee, and the good is that, as you saw down the stretch, weeks 13 through 17 of last season, he was the 8th highest scorer at any position in fantasy football. The bad news is that in week 1, he ran 19 routes. He had just 4 targets. A quiet night for him, but I do think things start to look back to normal for Tyler Higbee. Still a fringe top 10 tight end. That being said, if he's your number 2 tight end, I think you have better options to flex into your lineup today.
I would agree with you, Field. From Anthony Miller now to Scotty Miller, another Miller, the preferred Miller. Scooter Miller is somebody that we talked about earlier in the show. You heard Jeff Darlington reference him and how much they like him. Obviously, with Chris Godwin out, we expect him to be second on the team in targets after Mike Evans. Now, Justin Watson will be in the slot, but Scotty Miller lineup outside. But still, 5 for 73 on 6 targets last week. He played 62% of the snaps, and so I don't know, you think about this game against the Carolina Panthers, who struggled so mightily last week in all aspects of defense. They like Scotty Miller in Tampa Bay. Like, he was somebody that we talked about in the preseason as a sleeper. Obviously, he performed in week 1. And with Godwin out, the matchup is just amazing. I have Scotty Miller actually higher than this.
My sister's calling me right now. Clearly, she's watching the show. Or not. Dallas Goedert is number 6, our second tight end to make flex for this segment. Dallas Goedert was awesome in week 1. He had 8 catches. He had over 100 yards. He had a receiving touchdown as well. You don't often talk about tight ends much, as I said, in flex, but if he's your number 2 tight end, that is a great flex option. He looked the part and looked awesome in week 1.
All right, next up, we're talking about injuries allowing players to get big opportunities. We talked about Scott Miller with Chris Godwin out. Well, how about Corey Davis, who was the Titans wide receiver you wanted last week? He had 8 targets, tied for the team lead. He led the team with 34% of the team's air yards. He had 7 receptions, 101 yards, and now A.J. Brown is out of this game. It's not a matchup that scares you against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And so Corey Davis, look, we expect a big Derrick Henry game, of course, but Corey Davis, who, look, people, I mentioned this on the podcast this week. Could he be this year's Devontae Parker? Talented wide receiver coming out of college, was a high NFL draft pick. Disappointed, but we've seen flashes of his talent. And obviously in week 1, he was there. He was everything we expected him to be many years ago when he was drafted in the top 10 overall. So Corey Davis comes in at 5 in a good matchup and should get a lot of looks.
A week 1 star was Nyheim Hines. He had 2 touchdowns. Of course, Marlon Mack is out for the year due to an Achilles injury, which means Nyheim Hines isn't going anywhere. Now, Jonathan Taylor is going to have the early down usage, and he actually caught 6 passes for 67 yards in week 1. But Hines is a player that when he gets targets, he's going to bottle them up. And I expect there to be somewhere between 4 and 7 targets most weeks for Nyheim Hines, a talented player who I think has a chance to not be Austin Eckler and Melvin Gordon 2.0 in Indianapolis, but at least have some similar tenets to it this season.
Yeah, the red zone usage was very encouraging for Hines last week. Devin Singletary comes in at number 3. Look, I said earlier in the show that I think Zach Moss gets into the end zone, and so the lack of touchdown equity for Singletary when he's competing with both Moss and Josh Allen when they're getting close is a concern. But 14 touches in week 1, that led the team. And you think about this matchup with Miami. Dolphins allowed 217 rushing yards. Not a misprint, not a typo. Yeah. 217 rushing yards in week 1 against the Patriots. Obviously, a lot of that was Cam, but still, you can run on Miami, and that's exactly what Buffalo's going to do. And Devin Singletary going to be part of that.
Talked about Emmanuel Sanders plenty so far this show, with Michael Thomas being ruled out for Monday Night Football against the Las Vegas Raiders. Emmanuel Sanders led all players with 4 red zone targets in week 1. He should be busy again for the Saints Monday night, of course, on ESPN. That leaves us one player, Matthew.
It's Rojo. We've talked about Ronald Jones a lot, and we want to get some clarity in this Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield. But the fact is that Jones saw 73% of their touches in week 1. And we expect him to get a good share of that again in a great matchup with the Carolina Panthers. So Ronald Jones, who a lot of people are starting as a top 20 running back, if he's your flex, you're in pretty good shape today.
All right, coming up next, you know what we have.
Yeah, red zone, baby.
Red zone time.
Red zone, that's right. Give me the bump. Who's got the bump? I got the bump.
What do we got?
Oh, there you go. Look at that. Absolutely.
What?
Love it.
How was it him?
Come on now. That's
ridiculous.
Right, baby.
Come on. Take a look at the standings first, and I am definitely in first place, right?
Now you're in third.
We all are tied, and since I'm the defending champion from last year, I'm automatically in first place.
That was more of an age thing, Matthew. It's an age deference thing.
If you go in alphabetical order, I'm definitely in first.
I don't know.
If we go
3 titles last 4 years.
All right, Josh Jacobs, 100 or more rushing yards versus the Saints on Monday night, yes or no?
Yes.
No.
I'm going to go with no as well. We'll get you those answers next week when I will have a decided, commanding lead.
Yards. I see what you did.
It is
rushing
week
yards.
2. A reminder of all the injury updates we've been following, but most importantly, manage your emotions, guys. It's okay. If you lost last week, bounce back with a big victory. See us on the podcast all week. For Matthew and Stefania, I'm Field. Talk to you later.
Good luck.
Good luck. Let's get a win.